Chapter 40 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. Melchester, continued. The commotion wrought in Julian's mind by the abrupt incursion of Ethelberta into his quiet sphere was thorough and protracted. The witchery of her presence he had grown strong enough to withstand in part, but her composed announcement that she had intended to marry another, and, as far as he could understand, was intending it still, added a new chill to the old shade of disappointment which custom was day by day enabling him to endure. During the whole interval in which he had produced these diapason blasts, heard with such inharmonious feelings by the three auditors outside the screen, his thoughts had wandered wider than his notes in conjectures on the character and position of the gentleman seen in Ethelberta's company. Owing to his assumption that Lord Mountclere was but a stranger who had accidentally come in at the side door, Christopher had barely cast a glance upon him, and the wide difference between the years of the Viscount and those of his betrothed was not so particularly observed as to raise that point to an item in his objections now. Lord Mountclere was dressed with all the cunning that could be drawn from the metropolis by money and reiterated dissatisfaction. He prided himself on his upright carriage. His stick was so thin that the most malevolent could not insinuate that it was of any possible use in walking. His teeth had put on all the vigour and freshness of a second spring. Hence his look was the slowest of possible clocks in respect of his age, and his manner was equally as much in the rear of his appearance. Christopher was now over 25. He was getting so well accustomed to the spectacle of a world passing him by and splashing him with its wheels that he wondered why he had ever minded it. His habit of dreaming instead of doing had led him up to a curious discovery. It is no new thing for a man to fathom profundities by indulging humours. The active, the rapid, the people of splendid momentum have been surprised to behold what results attend the lives of those whose usual plan for discharging their active labours has been to postpone them indefinitely. Certainly the immediate result in his present case was, to all but himself, small and invisible, but it was of the nature of highest things. What he had learnt was that a woman who had once made a permanent impression upon a man cannot altogether deny him her image by denying him her company, and that by sedulously cultivating the acquaintance of this creature of contemplation, she becomes to him almost a living soul. Hence a sublimated Ethelberta accompanied him everywhere, one who never teased him, eluded him, or disappointed him. When he smiled, she smiled. When he was sad, she sorrowed. He may be said to have become the literal duplicate of that whimsical, unknown rhapsodist who wrote to his own similar situation, "By absence this good means I gain, that I can catch her, where none can watch her, in some close corner of my brain. There I embrace and kiss her, and so I both enjoy and miss her." This frame of mind naturally induced an amazing abstraction in the organist, never very vigilant at the best of times. He would stand and look fixedly at a frog in a shady pool, and never once think of batrachians, or pause by a green bank to split some tall blade of grass into filaments without removing it from its stalk, passing on, ignorant that he had made a cat o' nine tails of a graceful slip of vegetation. He would hear the cathedral clock strike 1, and go the next minute to see what time it was. "I never seed such a man as Mr. Julian is," said the head blower. "He'll meet me anywhere out of doors and never wink or nod. You'd hardly expect it. I don't find fault, but you'd hardly expect it, seeing how I play the same instrument as he do himself, and have done it for so many years longer than he. Oh, I've indulged that man, too. If 'tis pedals for 2 mortal hours of practice, I never complain, and he has plenty of vagaries. When 'tis hot summer weather, there's nothing will do for him but quah, grate, and swell together, till your face is in a vapour. And on a frosty winter's night he'll keep me there while he tweedles upon the 12th and 16th till me arm be scram for want of motion. I never speak a word out of doors." Somebody suggested that perhaps Christopher did not notice his coadjutor's presence in the street, and time proved to the organ blower that the remark was just. Whenever Christopher caught himself at these vacuous tricks, he would be struck with admiration of Ethelberta's wisdom, foresight, and self-command in refusing to wed such an incapable man. He felt that he ought to be pretty thankful that a bright memory of her was not also denied to him, and resolved to be content with it as a possession, since it was as much of her as he could decently maintain. Wrapped thus in a humorous sadness, he passed the afternoon under notice, and in the evening went home to Faith, who still lived with him, and showed no sign of ever being likely to do otherwise. Their present place and mode of life suited her well. She arrived at Melchester like an exotic sent home again. The leafy close, the climbing buttresses, the pondering ecclesiastics, the great doors, the singular keys, the whispered talk, echoes of lonely footsteps, the sunset shadow of the tall steeple reaching further into the town than the good bishop's teaching, and the general complexion of a spot where morning had the stillness of evening, and spring some of the tones of autumn, formed a proper background to a person constituted as Faith, who, like Miss Hepzibah Pyncheon's chicken, possessed in miniature all the antiquity of her progenitors. After tea, Christopher went into the streets, as was frequently his custom, less to see how the world crept on than there to walk up and down for nothing at all. It had been market day, and remnants of the royal population that had visited the town still lingered at corners, their toes hanging over the edge of the pavement, and their eyes wandering about the street. The angle which formed the turning-point of Christopher's promenade was occupied by a jeweller's shop, of a standing which completely outshone every other shop in that or any other trade throughout the town. Indeed, it was a staple subject of discussion in Melchester how a shop of such pretensions could find patronage sufficient to support its existence in a place which, though well populated, was not fashionable. It had not long been established there, and was the enterprise of an incoming man whose whole course of procedure seemed to be dictated by an intention to astonish the native citizens very considerably before he had done. Nearly everything was glass in the frontage of this fairy mart, and its contents glittered like the Hermocraesus stone. The panes being of plate glass, and the shop having two fronts, a diagonal view could be had through it from one to the other of the street to which it formed a corner. This evening, as on all evenings, a flood of radiance spread from the window-lamps into the thick autumn air, so that, from a distance, that corner appeared as the glistening nucleus of all the light in the town. Towards it, idle men and women unconsciously bent their steps, and closed in upon the panes like night-birds upon the lantern of a lighthouse. When Christopher reached the spot, there stood close to the pavement a plain, close carriage, apparently waiting for some person who was purchasing inside. Christopher would hardly have noticed this had he not also perceived, pressed against the glass of the shop window, an unusual number of local noses belonging to overgrown working lads, tosspots, an idiot, the ham-smoker's assistant with his sleeves rolled up, a Scotland lot freeholder, 3 or 4 sempstresses, the young women who brought home the washing, and so on. The interest of these gazers in some proceedings within, which by reason of the gaslight were as public as if carried on in the open air, was very great. "Here, that's what he's a-buying o', ha, ha, ha!" said one of the young men, as the shopman removed from the window a gorgeous blue velvet tray of wedding rings, and laid it on the counter. "'Tis what you may come to yourself sooner or later, God have mercy upon ye, and as such no scoffing matter," said an older man. "Faith, I'd as lief cry as laugh to see a man in that corner." "He's a gent getting up in years, too. He must have been through it a few times afore, seemingly, to sit down and buy the tools so cool as that." "Well, no, see what the shies would at such times. You bain't yourself then. No man living is hisself then." "True," said the ham-smoker's man. "'Tis a thought to look at, that a chap will take all this trouble to get a woman into his house, and a 12-month after would as soon hear it thunder as hear her sing." The policeman, standing near, was a humane man. Through having a young family he could hardly keep, and he hesitated about telling them to move on. Christopher had, before this time, perceived that the articles were laid down before an old gentleman who was seated in the shop, and that the gentleman was none other than he who had been with Ethelberta in the concert-room. The discovery was so startling that, constitutionally indisposed as he was to stand and watch, he became as glued to the spot as the other idlers. Finding himself now for the first time directly confronting the preliminaries of Ethelberta's marriage to a stranger, he was left with far less equanimity than he could have supposed possible to the situation. "So near the time," he said, and looked hard at Lord Mountclair. Christopher had now a far better opportunity than before for observing Ethelberta's betrothed. Apart from any bias of jealousy, disappointment, or mortification, he was led to judge that this was not quite the man to make Ethelberta happy. He had fancied her companion to be a man under 50. He was now visibly 60 or more, and it was not the sort of septuagenarianism besides which a young woman's happiness can sometimes contrive to keep itself alive in a quiet, sleepy way. Suddenly it occurred to him that this was the man whom he had helped in the carriage accident on the way to Knowlsea. He looked again. By no means undignified, the face presented that combination of slyness and jocundity which we are accustomed to imagine of the canonical jolly-jogs in medieval tales. The gamesome curate of Mewden might have supplied some parts of the countenance, cunning Friar Tuck the remainder. Nothing but the Viscount's constant habit of going to church every Sunday morning when at his country residence kept unholiness out of his features. For though he lived theologically enough on the Sabbath, as it became a man in his position to do, he was strikingly mundane all the rest of the week, always preferring the devil to God in his oaths. And nothing but antecedent good humour prevented the short fits of crossness incident to his passing infirmities from becoming established. His look was exceptionally jovial now, and the corners of his mouth twitched as the telegraph needles of 100 little erotic messages from his heart to his brain. Anybody could see that he was a merry man still, who loved good company, warming drinks, nymph-like shapes, and pretty words, in spite of the disagreeable suggestions he received from the pupils of his eyes and the joints of his lively limbs, that imps of mischief were busy sapping and mining in those regions, with the view of tumbling him into a certain cool cellar under the church aisle. In general, if a lover can find any ground at all for serenity in the tide of an elderly rival's success, he finds it in the fact itself of that ancientness. The other side seems less a rival than a makeshift. But Christopher no longer felt this, and the significant signs before his eyes of the imminence of Ethelberta's union with this old hero filled him with restless dread. True, the gentleman, as he appeared illuminated by the jeweller's gas-jets, seemed more likely to injure Ethelberta by indulgence than by severity, while her beauty lasted. But there was a nameless something in him less tolerable than this. The purchaser, having completed his dealings with the goldsmith, was conducted to the door by the master of the shop, and into the carriage, which was at once driven off up the street. Christopher now much desired to know the name of the man whom a nice chain of circumstantial evidence taught him to regard as the happy winner where scores had lost. He was grieved that Ethelberta's confessed reserve should have extended so far as to limit her to mere indefinite hints of marriage when they were talking almost on the brink of the wedding-day. That the ceremony was to be a private one, which it probably would be because of the disparity of ages, did not, in his opinion, justify her secrecy. He had shown himself capable of a transmutation as valuable as it is rare in men, the change from pestering lover to staunch friend, and this was all he had got for it. But even an old lover sunk to an indifferentist might have been tempted to spend an unoccupied half-hour in discovering particulars now, and Christopher had not lapsed nearly so far as to absolute unconcern. That evening, however, nothing came in his way to enlighten him. But the next day, when skirting the close on his ordinary duties, he saw the same carriage standing at a distance, and paused to behold the same old gentleman come from a well-known office and re-enter the vehicle. Lord Mountclair, in fact, in earnest pursuit of the business of yesternight, having just pocketed a document in which romance, rashness, law, and gospel are so happily made to work together that it may safely be regarded as the neatest compromise which has ever been invented since Adam sinned. This time Julian perceived that the brougham was one belonging to the White Hart Hotel, which Lord Mountclair was using partly from the necessities of these hasty proceedings, and also because, by so doing, he escaped the notice that might have been bestowed upon his own equipage or men-servants, the Mountclair Hammercloths being known in Melchester. Christopher now walked towards the hotel, leisurely, yet with anxiety. He inquired of a porter what people were staying there that night, and was informed that they had only one person in the house, Lord Mountclair, whom sudden and unexpected business had detained in Melchester since the previous day. Christopher lingered to hear no more. He retraced the street much more quickly than he had come, and he only said, "Lord Mountclair, it must never be." As soon as he entered the house, Faith perceived that he was greatly agitated. He at once told her of his discovery, and she explained, "What a brilliant match!" "Oh, Faith," said Christopher, "you don't know. You are far from knowing. It is as gloomy as midnight. Good God, can it be possible?" Faith blinked in alarm, without speaking. "Did you never hear anything of Lord Mountclair when we lived at Sandbourne?" "I knew the name, no more." No, of course you did not. Well, though I never saw his face, to my knowledge, till a short time ago, I know enough to say that, if earnest representations can prevent it, this marriage shall not be. Father knew him, or about him, very well, and he once told me what I cannot tell you. Fancy, I have seen him 3 times, yesterday, last night, and this morning, besides helping him on the road some weeks ago, and never once considered that he might be Lord Mountclair. He is here almost in disguise, one may say. Neither man nor horse is with him, and his object accounts for his privacy. I see how it is. She is doing this to benefit her brothers and sisters, if possible. But you ought to know that if she is miserable, they will never be happy. That's the nature of women. They take the form for the essence, and that's what she is doing now. I should think her guardian angel must have quitted her when she agreed to a marriage which may tear her heart out like a claw." "You are too warm about it, Kit. It cannot be as bad as that. It is not the thing, but the sensitiveness to the thing, which is the true measure of its pain. Perhaps what seems so bad to you falls lightly on her mind. A campaigner in a heavy rain is not more uncomfortable than when we are in a slight draught, and Ethelberta, fortified by her sapphires and gold cups and wax candles, will not mind facts which look like spectres to us outside. A title will turn troubles into romances, and she will shine as an interesting viscountess in spite of them." The discussion with Faith was not continued, Christopher stopping the argument by saying that he had a good mind to go off at once to Knowlesea and show her her danger. But till the next morning Ethelberta was certainly safe. No marriage was possible anywhere before then. He passed the afternoon in a state of great indecision, constantly reiterating, "I will go." End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. Workshops, an inn, the street. On an extensive plot of ground, lying somewhere between the Thames and the Kensington Squares, stood the premises of Messrs. Knockett and Perch, builders and contractors. The yard with its workshops formed part of one of those frontier lines between mangy business and garnished domesticity that occur in what are called improving neighbourhoods. We are accustomed to regard increase as the chief feature in a great city's progress, its well-known signs greeting our eyes on every outskirt. Slush-ponds may be seen turning into basement kitchens. A broad causeway of shattered earthenware smothers plots of budding gooseberry bushes and vegetable trenches, foundations following so closely upon gardens that the householder may be expected to find cadaverous sprouts from overlooked potatoes rising through the chinks of his cellar floor. But the other great process, that of internal transmutation, is not less curious than this encroachment of grey upon green. Its first erections are often only the milk-teeth of a suburb, and, as the district rises in dignity, they are dislodged by those which are to endure. Slightness becomes supplanted by comparative solidity, commonness by novelty, lowness and irregularity by symmetry and height. An observer of the precinct which has been named, as an instance in point, might have stood under a lamp-post and heard simultaneously the peal of the visitor's bell from the new terrace on the right hand, and the stroke of tools from the musty workshops on the left. Waggons laden with deals came up on this side, and landauls came down on the other, the former to lumber heavily through the old-established contractors' gates, the latter to sweep fashionably into the square. About 12 o'clock on the day following Lord Mountclair's exhibition of himself to Christopher in the jeweller's shop at Melchester, and almost at the identical time when the Viscount was seen to come from the office for marriage licenses in the same place, a carriage drove nearly up to the gates of Messrs. Knockit and Co.'s yard. A gentleman stepped out and looked around. He was a man whose years would have been pronounced as 45 by the friendly, 50 by the candid, 52 or 3 by the grim. He was as handsome a study in grey as could be seen in town, there being far more of the raven's plumage than of the gul's in the mixture as yet, and he had a glance of that practised sort which can measure people, weigh them, repress them, encourage them to sprout and blossom as a March sun encourages crocuses, ask them questions, give them answers, in short, a glance that could do as many things as an American cooking stove or a multum in parvo pocket-knife. But, as with most men of the world, this was mere mechanism. His actual emotions were kept so far within his person that they were rarely heard or seen near his features. On reading the builders' names over the gateway, he entered the yard, and asked at the office if Solomon Chickerell was engaged on the premises. The clerk was going to be very attentive, but finding the visitor had come only to speak to a workman, his tense attitude slackened a little, and he merely signified the foot of a Flemish ladder on the other side of the yard, saying, "You'll find him, sir, up there in the joiner's shop." When the man in the black coat reached the top, he found himself at the end of a long apartment, as large as a chapel and as low as a malt-room, across which ran parallel carpenters' benches to the number of 20 or more, a gangway being left at the side for access throughout. Behind every bench there stood a man or two, planing, fitting, or chiselling, as the case might be. The visitor paused for a moment, as if waiting for some cessation of their violent motions and uproar till he could make his errand known. He waited 10 seconds, he waited 20. But beyond that a quick look had been thrown upon him by every pair of eyes. The muscular performance were in no way interrupted. Every one seemed oblivious of his presence, and absolutely regardless of his wish. In truth, the texture of that salmon-coloured skin could be seen to be aristocratic without a microscope, and the exceptious artisan has an off-hand way, when contrasts are made painfully strong by an idler of this kind coming, gloved and brushed, into the very den where he is sweating and muddling in his shirt-sleeves. The gentleman from the carriage then proceeded down the workshop, wading up to his knees in a sea of shavings, and bruising his ankles against corners of board and sawn-off blocks that lay hidden like reefs beneath. At the 9th bench he made another venture. "Sol Chickerell," said the man addressed, as he touched his plain iron upon the oilstone. "He's one of them just behind." "Damn it all, can't one of you show me?" the visitor angrily observed, for he had been used to more attention than this. "Here, point him out." He handed the man a shilling. "No trouble to do that," said the workman, and he turned and signified Sol by a nod without moving from his place. The stranger entered Sol's division, and, nailing him with his eye, said at once, "I want to speak a few words with you in private. Is not Mrs. Petherwin your sister?" Sol started suspiciously. "Has anything happened to her?" he at length said hurriedly. "Oh, no, it is on a business matter that I have called. You need not mind owning the relationship to me. The secret will be kept." I am the brother of one whom you may have heard of from her, Lord Mountclair." "I have not. But if you will wait a minute, sir." He went to a little glazed box at the end of the shop, where the foreman was sitting, and, after speaking a few words to this person, Sol led Mountclair to the door and down the ladder. "I suppose we cannot very well talk here, after all," said the gentleman, when they reached the yard and found several men moving about therein. "Perhaps we had better go to some room. The nearest inn will answer the purpose, won't it?" "Excellently. There's the green bushes over the way. They have a very nice private room upstairs." "Yes, that will do." And, passing out of the yard, the man with the glance entered the inn with Sol, where they were shown to the parlour as requested. While the waiter was gone for some wine, which Mountclair ordered, the more ingenuous of the two resumed the conversation by saying awkwardly, "Yes, Mrs. Petherwin is my sister, as you suppose, sir. But on her account I do not let it be known." "Indeed," said Mountclair. "Well, I came to see you in order to speak of a matter which I thought you might know more about than I do, for it has taken me quite by surprise. My brother, Lord Mountclair, is, it seems, to be privately married to Mrs. Petherwin to-morrow." "Is that really the fact?" said Sol, becoming quite shaken. "I had no thought that such a thing could be possible." "It is imminent." "Father has told me that she has lately got to know some nobleman, but I never supposed there could be any meaning in that." "You were altogether wrong," said Mountclair, leaning back in his chair and looking at Sol steadily. "Do you feel it to be a matter upon which you will congratulate her?" "A very different thing," said Sol vehemently. "Though he is your brother, sir, I must say this, that I would rather she married the poorest man I know." "Why?" "From what my father has told me of him, he is not a more desirable brother-in-law to me than I shall be in all likelihood to him. What business has a man of that character to marry Berta, I should like to ask?" "That's what I say," returned Mountclair, revealing his satisfaction at Sol's estimate of his noble brother. It showed that he had calculated well in coming here. "My brother is getting old, and he has lived strangely. Your sister is a highly respectable young lady." "And he's not respectable, you mean?" "I know he's not. I worked near Dankworth once." "I cannot say that," returned Mountclair. Possibly a certain fraternal feeling repressed a direct assent, and yet this was the only representation which could be expected to prejudice the young man against the wedding, if he were to be such a one as the visitor supposed Sol to be, a man vulgar in sentiment and ambition, but pure in his anxiety for his sister's happiness. "At any rate, we are agreed in thinking that this would be an unfortunate marriage for both?" added Mountclair. "About both I don't know. It may be a good thing for him. When do you say it is to be, sir? To-morrow?" "Yes." "I don't know what to do," said Sol, walking up and down. "If half what I have heard is true, I would lose a winter's work to prevent her marrying him. What does she want to go mixing in with people who despise her for? Now look here, Mr. Mountclair, since you've been and called me out to talk this over, it's only fair that you should tell me the exact truth about your brother. Is it a lie, or is it true that he is not fit to be the husband of a decent woman?" "That is a curious inquiry," said Mountclair, whose manner and aspect, neutral as a winter landscape, had little in common with Sol's warm and unrestrained bearing. "There are reasons why I think your sister will not be happy with him." "Then it is true what they say," said Sol, bringing down his fist upon the table. "I know your meaning well enough. What's to be done? If I could only see her this minute, she might be kept out of it." "You think your presence would influence your sister, if you could see her before the wedding?" "I think it would. But who's to get at her?" "I am going, so you had better come with me, unless it would be best for your father to come." "Perhaps it might," said the bewildered Sol. "But he will not be able to get away, and it's no use for Dan to go. If anybody goes, I must. If she's made up her mind, nothing can be done by writing to her." "I leave at once to see Lord Mountclair," the other continued. "I feel that, as my brother is evidently ignorant of the position of Mrs. Petherwin's family and connections, it is only fair in me, as his nearest relative, to make them clear to him before it is too late." "You mean
that if he knew her friends were working people, he would not think of her as a wife. 'Tis a reasonable thought. But make your mind easy, she has told him. I make a great mistake if she has for a moment thought of concealing that from him. She may not have deliberately done so, but, and I say this with no ill feeling, it is a matter known to few, and she may have taken no steps to undeceive him. I hope to bring him to see the matter clearly. Unfortunately, the thing has been so secret and hurried that there is barely time. I knew nothing until this morning. Never dreamt of such a preposterous occurrence. Preposterous? If it should come to pass, she would play her part as his lady as well as any other woman, and better. I wish there was no more reason for fear on my side than there is on yours. Things have come to a sore head when she is not considered lady enough for such as he. But perhaps your meaning is that if your brother were to have a son, you would lose your heir presumptive title to the coronet of Montclair. Well, 'twould be rather hard for ye, now I come to think of it. Upon my life 'twould. The suggestion is as delicate as the atmosphere of this vile room, but let your ignorance be your excuse, my man. It is hardly worth while for us to quarrel when we both have the same object in view. Do you not think so? That's true, that's true. When do you start, sir? We must leave almost at once, said Montclair, looking at his watch. If we cannot catch the 2 o'clock train, there's no getting there tonight, and tomorrow we could not possibly arrive before 1. I wish there was time for me to go and tidy myself a bit, said Sol, anxiously looking down at his working clothes. I suppose you would not like me to go with you like this. Confound the clothes! If you cannot start in 5 minutes, we shall not be able to go at all. Very well, then. Wait while I run across to the shop, then I'm ready. How do we get to the station? My carriage is at the corner waiting. When you come out, I will meet you at the gates. Sol then hurried downstairs, and a minute or two later Mr. Montclair followed, looking like a man bent on policy at any price. The carriage was brought round by the time that Sol reappeared from the yard. He entered and sat down beside Montclair, not without a sense that he was spoiling good upholstery. The coachman then allowed the lash of his whip to alight with the force of a small fly upon the horses, which set them up in an angry trot. Sol rolled on beside his new acquaintance with the shamefaced look of a man going to prison in a van, for pedestrians occasionally gazed at him, full of what seemed to himself to be ironical surprise. "I'm afraid I ought to have changed my clothes after all," he said, writhing under a perception of the contrast between them. "Not knowing anything about this, I ain't a bit prepared. If I'd got even my second-best hat, it wouldn't be so bad." "It makes no difference," said Montclair inanimately. "Or I might have brought my portmantle with some things." "It really is not important." On reaching the station, they found there were yet a few minutes to spare, which Sol Chapter 42 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 42. The Doncastle's Residence, and Outside the same. Mrs. Doncastle's dressing bell had rung, but Menlove, the lady's maid, having at the same time received a letter by the evening post, paused to read it before replying to the summons. Ankworth Court, Wednesday. Darling Louisa, I can assure you that I am no more likely than yourself to form another attachment, as you will perceive by what follows. Before we left town, I thought that to be able to see you occasionally was sufficient for happiness, but down in this lonely place the case is different. In short, my dear, I ask you to consent to a union with me as soon as you possibly can. Your prettiness has won my eyes and lips completely, sweet, and I lie awake at night to think of the golden curls you allowed to escape from their confinement on those nice times of private clothes, when we walked in the park and slipped the bonds of service, which you were never born to any more than I. Had not my own feelings been so strong, I should have told you at the first dash of my pen that what I expected is coming to pass at last. The old dog is going to be privately married to Mrs. P. Yes, indeed, and the wedding is coming off to-morrow, secret as the grave. All her friends will doubtless leave service on account of it. What he does now makes little difference to me, of course, as I had already given warning, but I shall stick to him like a Briton in spite of it. He has to-day made me a present, and a further £5 for yourself, expecting you to hold your tongue on every matter connected with Mrs. P.'s friends, and to say nothing to any of them about this marriage until it is over. His lordship impressed this upon me very strong, and familiar as a brother, and of course we obey his instructions to the letter, for I need hardly say that unless he keeps his promise to help me in setting up the shop, our nuptials cannot be consumed. His help depends upon our obedience, as you are aware." This, and much more, was from her very last lover, Lord Mountclair's valet, who had been taken in hand directly she had convinced herself of Jerry's hopeless youthfulness. The missive sent Mrs. Menlove's spirits soaring like spring larks. She flew upstairs in answer to the bell with a joyful, triumphant look, which the illuminated figure of Mrs. Doncaster in her dressing-room could not quite repress. One could almost forgive Menlove her arts, when so modest a result brought such vast content. Mrs. Doncaster seemed inclined to make no remark during the dressing, and at last Menlove could repress herself no longer. "I should like to name something to you, Mum." "Yes?" "I shall be wishing to leave soon, if it is convenient." "Very well, Menlove," answered Mrs. Doncaster, as she serenely surveyed her right eyebrow in the glass. "Am I to take this as a formal notice?" "If you please, but I could stay a week or two beyond the month, if suitable. I'm going to be married, that's what it is, Mum." "Oh, I'm glad to hear it, though I'm sorry to lose you." "It is Lord Mountclair's valet, Mr. Tipman, Mum." "Indeed." Menlove went on building up Mrs. Doncaster's hair a while in silence. "I suppose you heard the other news that arrived in town to-day, Mum?" she said again. "Lord Mountclair is going to be married to-morrow." "To-morrow? Are you quite sure?" "Oh, yes, Mum. Mr. Tipman has just told me so in his letter. He's going to be married to Mrs. Petherwin. It is to be quite a private wedding." Mrs. Doncaster made no remark, and she remained in the same still position as before, but a countenance expressing transcendent surprise was reflected to Menlove by the glass. At this sight Menlove's tongue so burned to go further and unfold the lady's relations with the butler downstairs, that she would have lost a month's wages to be at liberty to do it. The disclosure was almost too magnificent to be repressed. To deny herself so exquisite an indulgence required an effort which nothing on earth could have sustained save the one thing that did sustain it, the knowledge that upon her silence hung the most enormous desideratum in the world, her own marriage. She said no more, and Mrs. Doncaster went away. It was an ordinary family dinner that day, but their nephew, Nay, happened to be present. Just as they were sitting down, Mrs. Doncaster said to her husband, "Why have you not told me of the wedding to-morrow? Or don't you know anything about it?" "Wedding?" said Mr. Doncaster. "Lord Mountclair is to be married to Mrs. Petherwin quite privately." "Good God!" said some person. Mr. Doncaster did not speak the words. They were not spoken by Nay. They seemed to float over the room and round the walls, as if originating in some spiritualistic source. Yet Mrs. Doncaster, remembering the symptoms of attachment between Ethelberta and her nephew, which had appeared during the summer, looked towards Nay instantly, as if she thought the words must have come from him after all. But Nay's face was perfectly calm. He, together with her husband, was sitting with his eyes fixed in the direction of the sideboard, and, turning to the same spot, she beheld Chickerell standing pale as death, his lips being parted as if he did not know where he was. "Did you speak?" said Mrs. Doncaster, looking with astonishment at the butler. "Chickerell, what's the matter? Are you ill?" said Mr. Doncaster simultaneously. "Was it you who said that?" I did, sir," said Chickerell, in a husky voice scarcely above a whisper. "I could not help it." "Why?" "She is my daughter, and it shall be known at once." "Who is your daughter?" He paused a few moments nervously. "Mrs. Petherwin," he said. Upon this announcement, Nay looked at poor Chickerell as if he saw through him into the wall. Mrs. Doncaster uttered a faint exclamation and leant back in her chair. The bare possibility of the truth of Chickerell's claims to such paternity shook her to pieces when she viewed her intimacies with Ethelberta during the past season. The court she had paid her, the arrangements she had entered into to please her, above all the dinner party which she contrived and carried out solely to gratify Lord Mountclere and bring him into personal communication with the general favourite, thus making herself probably the chief, though unconscious, instrument in promoting a match by which her butler was to become father-in-law to a peer she delighted to honour. The crowd of perceptions almost took away her life. She closed her eyes in a white shiver.
"Do you mean to say that the lady who sat here at dinner at the same time that Lord Mountclere was present is your daughter?" asked Doncaster.
"Yes, sir," said Chickerell respectively.
"How did she come to be your daughter?"
Well, she is my daughter, sir."
"Did you educate her?"
"Not altogether, sir. She was a very clever child. Lady Pethermin took a deal of trouble about her education. They were both left widows about the same time. The son died, then the father. My daughter was only 17 then, but though she's older now, her marriage with Lord Mountclere means misery. He ought to marry another woman."
"It is very extraordinary,"
Mr. Doncaster murmured.
"If you are ill, you'd better go and rest yourself, Chickerell. Send in Thomas."
Chickerell, who seemed to be much disturbed, then very gladly left the room, and dinner proceeded. But such was the peculiarity of the case that, though there was in it neither murder, robbery, illness, accident, fire, or any other of the tragic and legitimate shakers of human nerves, two of the three who were gathered there sat through the meal without the least consciousness of what viands had composed it. Impressiveness depends as much upon propinquity as upon magnitude, and to have honoured unawares the daughter of the vilest Antipodean miscreant and murderer would have been less discomforting to Mrs. Doncaster than it was to make the same blunder with the daughter of a respectable servant who happened to live in her own house. To Ney, the announcement was as a catastrophe of a story already begun, rather than as an isolated wonder. Ethelberta's words had prepared him for something, though the nature of that thing was unknown. "Chickerell ought not to have kept us in ignorance of this. Of course he ought not," said Mrs. Doncaster as soon as they were left alone.
"I don't see why not,"
replied Mr. Doncaster, who took the matter very coolly, as was his custom. "Then she herself should have let it be known."
"Nor does that follow. You didn't tell Mrs. Petherwin that your grandfather narrowly escaped hanging for shooting his rival in a duel?"
"Of course not. There was no reason why I should give extraneous information."
"Nor was there any reason why she should. As for Chickerell, he doubtless felt how unbecoming it would be to make personal remarks upon one of your guests." "Ha, ha, ha! Well, well,
I know this," said Mrs. Doncaster in great anger, "that if my father had been in the room, I should have not let the fact pass unnoticed, and treated him like a stranger."
"Would you have had her introduce Chickerell to us all round?"
"My dear Margaret, it was a complicated position for a woman." "Then she ought not to have come."
"There may be something in that, though she was dining out at other houses as good as ours. Well, I should have done just as she did, for the joke of the thing. Ha, ha, ha! It is very good, very. It was a case in which the appetite for a jest would overpower the sting of conscience in any well-constituted being. That, my dear, I must maintain."
"I say she should not have come," answered Mrs. Doncaster firmly. "Of course I shall dismiss Chickerell."
"Of course you will do no such thing. I have never had a butler in the house before who suited me so well. It is a great credit to the man to have such a daughter, and I am not sure that we do not derive some lustre of a humble kind from his presence in the house. But seriously, I wonder at your short-sightedness when you know the troubles we have had through getting new men from nobody knows where."
Ney, perceiving that the breeze in the atmosphere might ultimately intensify to a palpable black squall, seemed to think it would be well to take leave of his uncle and aunt as soon as he conveniently could. Nevertheless, he was much less discomposed by the situation than by the active cause which had led to it. When Mrs. Doncastle arose, her husband said he was going to speak to Chickerell for a minute or two, and Ney followed his aunt upstairs. Presently Doncastle joined them. "I've been talking to Chickerell," he said. "It's a very curious affair, this marriage of his daughter and Lord Mountclair. The whole situation is the most astounding I've ever met with. The man is quite ill about the news. He's shown me a letter which has just reached him from his son on the same subject. Lord Mountclair's brother and this young man have actually gone off together to try to prevent the wedding, and Chickerell has asked to be allowed to go himself, if he can get soon enough to the station to catch the night mail. Of course he may go if he wishes." "What a funny thing," said the lady, with a wretchedly factitious smile. The times have taken a strange turn when the angry parent of the comedy, who goes post-haste to prevent the undutiful daughter's rash marriage, is a gentleman from below stairs, and the unworthy lover a peer of the realm. Ney spoke for almost the first time. "I don't blame Chickerell in objecting to Lord Mountclair. I should object to him myself if I had a daughter. I never liked him." "Why?" said Mrs. Doncastle, lifting her eyelids as if the act were a heavy task. "For reasons which don't generally appear." "Yes," said Mr. Doncastle in a low tone. "Still, we must not believe all we hear." "Is Chickerell going?" said Ney. "He leaves in 5 or 10 minutes," said Doncastle. After a few further words, Ney mentioned that he was unable to stay longer that evening, and left them. When he reached the outside of the door, he walked a little way up the pavement and back again, as if reluctant to lose sight of the street, finally standing under a lamp-post whence he could command a view of Mr. Doncastle's front. Presently a man came out in a greatcoat and with a small bag in his hand. Ney, at once recognizing the person as Chickerell, went up to him. "Mr. Doncastle tells me you are going on a sudden journey. What time does your train leave?" Ney asked. "I go by the 10 o'clock, sir. I hope it is a third class," said Chickerell, "though I'm afraid it may not be." "It is much as you will do to get to the station," said Ney, turning the face of his watch to the light. "Here, come into my cab. I'm driving that way." "Thank you, sir," said Chickerell. Ney called a cab at the first opportunity, and they entered and drove along together. Neither spoke during the journey. When they were driving up to the station entrance, Ney looked again to see the hour. "You have not a minute to lose," he said in repressed anxiety, "and your journey will be expensive. Instead of walking from Anglebury to Knowlesea, you had better drive. Above all, don't lose time. Never mind what class the train is. Take this from me, since the emergency is great." He handed something to Chickerell folded up small. The butler took it without inquiry, and stepped out hastily. "I sincerely hope she— Well, good night, Chickerell," continued Ney, ending his words abruptly. The cab containing him drove again towards the station gates, leaving Chickerell standing on the curb. He passed through the booking-office and looked at the paper Ney had put into his hand. It was a £5 note. Chapter 43 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 43. The Railway, the Sea, the Shore Beyond. By this time Sol and the Honourable Edgar Mountclair had gone far on their journey into Wessex. Ankworth Court, Mountclair's destination, though several miles from Knowlesea, was most easily accessible by the same route as that to the village, the latter being the place for which Sol was bound. From the few words that passed between them on the way, Mountclair became more stubborn than ever in a belief that this was a carefully laid trap of the fair Ethelberta's to ensnare his brother without revealing to him her family ties, which it therefore behoved him to make clear with the utmost force of representation before the fatal union had been contracted. Being himself the Viscount's only remaining brother and near relative, the disinterestedness of his motives may be left to imagination. That there was much real excuse for his conduct must, however, be borne in mind. Whether his attempt would prevent their union was another question. He believed that, conjoined with his personal influence over the Viscount, and the importation of Sol as a firebrand to throw between the betrothed pair, it might do so. About half an hour before sunset, the two individuals, linked by their differences, reached the point of railway at which the branch to Sandbourne left the main line. They had taken tickets for Sandbourne, intending to go thence to Knowlesea by the steamer that plied between the two places during the summer months, making this a short and direct route. But it occurred to Mountclair on the way that, summer being over, the steamer might possibly have left off running. The wind might be too high for a small boat, and no large one might be at hand for hire. Therefore it would be safer to go by train to Anglebury, and the remaining 16 miles by driving over the hills, even at a great loss of time. Accident, however, determined otherwise. They were in the station at the junction, inquiring of an official if the Speedwell had ceased to sail, when a countryman who had just come up from Sandbourne stated that, though the Speedwell had left off for the year, there was that day another steamer at Sandbourne. This steamer would of necessity return to Knowlesea that evening, partly because several people from that place had been on board, and also because the Knowlesea folk were waiting for groceries and draperies from London. There was not an ounce of tea or 100 weight of coal in the village, owing to the recent winds, which had detained the provision parcels at Sandbourne, and kept the colliers up channel until the change of weather this day. To introduce necessaries by a roundabout land journey was not easy when they had been ordered by the other and habitual route. The boat returned at 6 o'clock. So on they went to Sandbourne, driving off to the pier directly they reached that place, for it was getting towards night. The steamer was there, as the man had told them, much to the relief of Sol, who, being extremely anxious to enter Knowlesea before a late hour, had known that this was the only way in which it could be done. Some unforeseen incident delayed the boat, and they walked up and down the pier to wait. The prospect was gloomy enough. The wind was north-east, the sea along shore was a chalky green, though comparatively calm, this part of the coast forming a shelter from wind in its present quarter. The clouds had different velocities, and some of them shone with a coppery glare produced by rays from the west which did not enter the inferior atmosphere at all. It was reflected on the distant waves in patches, with an effect as if the waters were at those particular spots stained with blood. This departed, and what daylight was left to the earth came from strange and unusual quarters of the heavens. The zenith would be bright, as if that were the place of the sun. Then all overhead would close, and a whiteness in the east would give the appearance of morning, while a bank as thick as a wall barricaded the west, which looked as if it had no acquaintance with sunsets, and would blush red no more. "Any other passengers?" shouted the master of the steamboat. "We must be off. It may be a dirty night." Sol and Mountclair went on board, and the pier receded in the dusk. "Shall we have any difficulty in getting into Knowlesea Bay?" said Mountclair. "Not if the wind keeps where it is for another hour or two." "I fancy it is shifting to the eastward," said Sol. The captain looked as if he had thought the same thing. "I hope I shall be able to get home tonight," said a Knowlesea woman. "My little children be left alone. Your missus is in a bad way too, isn't she, skipper?" "Yes." "And you got the doctor from Sandbourne aboard to tend her?" "Yes." "Then you be sure to put it to Knowlesea if you can." "Yes, don't be alarmed, ma'am. We'll do what we can, but no one must boast." The skipper's remark was the result of an observation that the wind had at last flown to the east, the single point of the compass whence it could affect Knowlesea Bay. The result of this change was soon perceptible. About midway in their transit, the land elbowed out to a bold chalk promontory. Beyond this stretched a vertical wall of the same cliff, in a line parallel with their course. In fair weather it was possible and customary to steer close along under this hoary facade for the distance of a mile, there being 6 fathoms of water within a few boat-sea lengths of the precipice. But it was an ugly spot at the best of times, landward no less than seaward, the cliff rounding off at the top in vegetation like a forehead with low-grown hair, no defined edge being provided as a warning to unwary pedestrians on the downs above. As the wind sprung up stronger, white clots could be discerned at the water level of the cliff, rising and falling against the black band of shaggy weed that formed a sort of skirting to the base of the wall. They were the first fruits of the new east blast, which shaved the face of the cliff like a razor. Gatherings of foam in the shape of heads, shoulders, and arms of snowy whiteness, apparently struggling to rise from the deeps and ever sinking back to their old levels again. They reminded an observer of a drowning scene in a picture of the deluge. At some points the face of rock was hollowed into gaping caverns, and the water began to thunder into these with a leap that was only topped by the rebound seaward again. The vessel's head was kept a little further to sea, but beyond that everything went on as usual. The precipice was still in view, and before it several huge columns of rock appeared, detached from the mass behind. Two of these were particularly noticeable in the grey air, one vertical, stout, and square, the other slender and tapering. They were individualized as husband and wife by the coastmen. The waves leapt up their sides like a pack of hounds. This, however, though fearful in its boisterousness, was nothing to the terrible games that sometimes went on round the knees of those giants in stone. Yet it was sufficient to cause the course of the frail steamboat to be altered yet a little more, from south-west by south to south by west, to give the breakers a still wider berth. "I wish we'd gone by land, sir, it would have been surer play," said Saul to Mountclair, a cat-and-dog friendship having arisen between them. "Yes," said Mountclair, "Nulsea is an abominable place to get into with an east wind blowing, they say." Another circumstance conspired to make their landing more difficult, which Mountclair knew nothing of. With the wind easterly, the highest seas prevailed in Nulsea Bay from the slackening of the flood tide to the first hour of ebb. At that time the water outside stood without a current, and ridges and hollows chased each other towards the beach unchecked. When the tide was setting strong up or down channel, its flow across the mouth of the bay thrust aside, to some extent, the landward plunge of the waves. We glanced for a moment at the state of affairs on the land they were nearing. This was the time of year to know the truth about the inner nature and character of Nulsea, for to see Nulsea smiling to the summer sun was to see a courtier before a king. Nulsea was not to be known by such simple means. The half-dozen detached villas used as lodging-houses in the summer, standing aloof from the cots of the permanent race, rose in the dusk of this gusty evening, empty, silent, damp, and dark as tombs. The gravel walks leading to them were invaded by leaves and tufts of grass. As the darkness thickened, the wind increased, and each blast raked the iron railings before the houses till they hummed as if in a song of derision. Certainly it seemed absurd at this time of year that human beings should expect comfort in a spot capable of such moods as these. However, one of the houses looked cheerful, and that was the dwelling to which Ethelberta had gone. Its gay external colours might as well have been black for anything that could be seen of them now, but an unblinded window revealed inside it a room bright and warm. It was illuminated by firelight only. Within, Ethelberta appeared against the curtains, close to the glass. She was watching through a binocular a faint light which had become visible in the direction of the bluff far away over the bay. "Here is the spruce at last, I think," she said to her sister, who was by the fire. "I hope they will be able to land the things I have ordered. They are on board, I know." The wind continued to rise, till at length something from the lungs of the gale alighted like a feather upon the pane, and remained there sticking. Seeing the substance, Ethelberta opened the windows to secure it. The fire roared, and the pitchers kicked the walls. She closed the sash, and brought to the light a crisp fragment of foam. "How suddenly the sea must have risen," said Peggotty. The servant entered the room. "Please, missus says she's afraid you won't have your things tonight, They say the steamer can't land, and missus wants to know if she can do anything." "It is of no consequence," said Ethelberta. "They will come some time, unless they go to the bottom." The girl left the room. "Shall we go down to the shore and see what the night is like?" said Ethelberta. "This is the last opportunity I shall have." "Is it right for us to go, considering you are to be married to-morrow?" said Picotee, who had small affection for nature in this mood. Her sister laughed. "Let us put on our cloaks. Nobody will know us. I am sorry to leave this grim and primitive place, even for Enkworth Court." They wrapped themselves up and descended the hill. On drawing near the battling line of breakers which marked the meeting of sea and land, they could perceive within the nearly invisible horizon an equilateral triangle of lights. It was formed of 3 stars, a red on the one side, a green on the other, and a white on the summit. This, composed of masthead and side lamps, was all that was visible of the spruce, which now faced end on about half a mile distant, and was still nearing the pier. The girls went further, and stood on the foreshore listening to the din. Seaward appeared nothing distinct save a black horizontal band embodying itself out of the grey water, strengthening its blackness, and enlarging till it looked like a nearing wall. It was the concave face of a coming wave. On its summit a white edging arose with the aspect of a lace frill. It broadened and fell over the front with a terrible concussion. Then all before them was a sheet of whiteness, which spread with amazing rapidity, till they found themselves standing in the midst of it, as in a field of snow. Both felt an insidious chill encircling their ankles, and they rapidly ran up the beach.
"You girls, come away there, or you'll be washed off. What need have ye for going so near?"
Ethelberta recognized the stentorian voice as that of Captain Flower, who, with a party of boatmen, was discovered to be standing near, under the shelter of a wall. He did not know them in the gloom, and they took care that he should not. They retreated further up the beach, when the hissing fleece of froth slid again down the shingle, dragging the pebbles under it with a rattle as of a beast gnawing bones. The spot whereon the men stood was called Down Under Wall. It was a nook commanding a full view of the bay, and hither the nautical portion of the village unconsciously gravitated on windy afternoons and nights, to discuss past disasters in the reticent spirit induced by a sense that they might at any moment be repeated. The stranger who should walk the shore on roaring and sobbing November eves, when there was not light sufficient to guide his footsteps, and muse on the absoluteness of the solitude, would be surprised by a smart "good night" being returned from this corner, in company with the echo of his tread. In summer the 6 or 8 perennial figures stood on the breezy side of the wall, in winter and in rain to leeward, but no weather was known to dislodge them.
"I had no sooner come ashore when the wind began to fly round," said the previous speaker, "and it must have been about the time they were off Old Harry Point. I shall put back for certain, I said, and I had no more thought of seeing her than John's set net that was carried round the point of Monday. Poor fellow, his wife being in such a state makes him anxious to land if he can. That's what 'tis, plain enough."
"Why that?" said Flower.
The doctor's aboard, I believe. I'll have the most understanding man in Sandbourne, cost me little or much," he said. "'Tis all over, and she's better," said the other. "I called half an hour afore dark."
Flower, being an experienced man, knew how the judgment of a ship's master was liable to be warped by family anxieties, many instances of the same having occurred in the history of navigation. He felt uneasy, for he knew the deceit and guile of this bay far better than did the master of the Spruce, who, till within a recent few months, had been a stranger to the place. Indeed, it was the bay which had made Flower what he was, instead of a man in thriving retirement. The 2 great ventures of his life had been blown ashore and broken up within that very semicircle. The sturdy sailor now stood with his eyes fixed on the triangle of lights which showed that the steamer had not relinquished her intention of bringing up inside the pier if possible. His right hand was in his pocket, where it played with a large key which lay there. It was the key of the lifeboat shed, and Flower was coxswain. His musing was on the possibility of a use for it this night. It appeared that the captain of the Spruce was aiming to pass in under the lee of the pier, but a strong current of 4 or 5 knots was running between the piles, drifting the steamer away at every attempt as soon as she slowed. To come in on the other side was dangerous, the hull of the vessel being likely to crash against and overthrow the fragile erection, with damage to herself also. Flower, who had disappeared for a few minutes, now came back.
"It's just possible I can make 'em hear with the trumpet now that they beat to leeward," he said,
and proceeded with 2 or 3 others to grope his way out upon the pier, which consisted simply of a row of rotten piles covered with rotten planking, no balustrade of any kind existing to keep the unwary from tumbling off. At the water level the piles were eaten away by the action of the sea to about the size of a man's wrist, and at every fresh influx the whole structure trembled like a spider's web. In this lay the danger of making fast, for a strong pull from a headfast rope might drag the erection completely over. Flower arrived at the end, where a lantern hung.
"Spruce ahoy!"
he blared through the speaking trumpet 2 or 3 times. There seemed to be a reply of some sort from the steamer.
"Duty's kill have loosened the pier a couple mounts. The bollards be too weak to make fast. Must land in boats if ye will land, but dangerous. Your wife is out of danger, and 'tis a boy."
Ethelberta and Picardy were at this time standing on the beach 150 yards off. Whether or not the master of the steamer received the information volunteered by Flower, the 2 girls saw the triangle of lamps get narrow at its base, reduce themselves to 2 in a vertical line, then to 1, then to darkness. The spruce had turned her head from Nolsey. "They've gone back, and I shall not have my wedding things after all," said Ethelberta. "Well, I must do without them."
"You see, 'twas best to play shorel," said Flower to his comrades in a tone of complacency. "They might have been able to do it, but 'twas risky. The shop folk be out of stock, I hear, and the visiting lady up the hill is terribly in want of clothes, so 'tis said. But what's that? Aunt's ought to have put back afore." Then the lantern which hung at the end of the jetty was taken down, and the darkness enfolded all around from view. The bay became nothing but a voice, the foam an occasional touch upon the face, the spruce an imagination, the pier a memory. Everything lessened upon the senses but one. That was the wind. It mauled their persons like a hand, and caused every scrap of their raiment to tug westward. To stand with a face to sea brought semi-suffocation from the intense pressure of air. The boatmen retired to their position under the wall, to lounge again in silence. Conversation was not considered necessary. Their sense of each other's presence formed a kind of conversation. Meanwhile, Picardy and Ethelberta went up the hill. "If your wedding were going to be a public one, what a misfortune this delay of the packages would be," said Picardy. "Yes," replied the elder. "I think the bracelet the prettiest of all the presents he brought to-day. Do you?" "It is the most valuable." "Lord Montclair is very kind, is he not? I like him a great deal better than I did. Do you, Berta?" "Yes, very much better," said Ethelberta, warming a little. "If he were not so suspicious at odd moments, I should like him exceedingly. But I must cure him of that by a regular course of treatment, and then he'll be very nice. For an old man, he likes you better than any young man would take the trouble to do. I wish somebody else were old, too." "He will be some day." "Yes, but never mind. Time will straighten many crooked things." "Do you think Lord Montclair has reached home by this time?" "I should think so, though I believe he had to call at the parsonage before leaving Dulcie." "Had he? What for?" "Why, of course, somebody must— Oh, yes. Do you think anybody in Dulcie knows it's going to be, except us and the parson?" "I suppose the clerk knows." "I wonder if a lord has ever been married so privately before." "Frequently, when he marries far beneath him, as is in this case. But even if I could have had it, I should not have liked a showy wedding. I've had no experience as a bride, except in the private form of the ceremony. Berta, I'm sometimes uneasy about you, even now, and I want to ask you one thing, if I may. Are you doing this for my sake? Would you have married Mr. Julian if it had not been for me?" "It's difficult to say exactly.
It is possible that if I had no relation at all, I might have married him, and I might not. I don't intend to marry." "In that case you will live with me at Enkworth. However, we will leave such details till the groundwork is confirmed. When we get indoors, will you see if the boxes have been properly corded and are quite ready to be sent for? Then come in and sit by the fire, and I'll sing some songs to you." "Sad ones, you mean?" "No, they shall not be sad. Perhaps they may be the last you will ever sing to me." "There may be such a thing as has occurred." "But we will not think so. We'll suppose you are to sing many to me yet." "Yes, there's good sense in that, Pickety. In a world where the blind only are cheerful, we should all do well to put out our eyes. There, I did not mean to get you into this state. Forgive me, Pickety. It is because I have had a thought, why I cannot tell, that as much as this man brings to me in ranks and gifts, he may take out of me in tears." "Berta!" "But there's no reason in it, not any. For not in a single matter does what has been supply us with any certain ground for knowing what will be in the world. I have seen marriages where happiness might have been said to be ensured, and there have been all sadness afterwards. And I have seen those in which the prospect was black as night, and they have led on to a time of sweetness and comfort. And I have seen marriages neither joyful nor sorry, that have become either as accident forced them to become, the persons having no voice in it at all. Well, then, why should I be afraid to make a plunge when chance is as trustworthy as calculation?" "If you don't like him well enough, don't have him, Berta. There's time enough to put it off even now." "Oh, no, I would not upset a well-considered course on the haste of an impulse. Our will should withstand our misgivings. Now let's see if all has been packed, and then we'll sing." That evening, while the wind was wheeling round and round the dwelling, and the calm eye of the lighthouse afar was a single speck perceptible of the outside world from the door of Ethelberta's temporary home, the music of songs mingled with the stroke of the wind across the iron railings, and was swept on in the general tide of the gale and the noise of the rolling sea, till not the echo of a tone remained. An hour before this singing, an old gentleman might have been seen to alight from a little one-horse brougham, and enter the door of Nulsea parsonage. He was bent upon obtaining an entrance to the vicar's study without giving his name. But it happened that the vicar's wife was sitting in the front room making a pillow-case for the children's bed out of an old surplice which had been excommunicated the previous Easter. She heard the newcomer's voice through the partition, started, and went quickly to her husband, who was where he ought to have been, in his study. At her entry he looked up with an abstracted gaze, having been lost in meditation over a little schooner which he was attempting to rig for their youngest boy. At a word from his wife on the suspected name of the visitor, he resumed his earlier occupation of inserting a few strong sentences, full of the observation of maturer life, between the lines of a sermon written during his first years of ordination, in order to make it available for the coming Sunday. His wife then vanished with the little ship in her hand, and the visitor appeared. Her talk went on in low tones. After a 10-minute stay he departed as secretly as he had come. His errand was the cause of much whispered discussion between the vicar and his Chapter 44 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 44. Sandbourne, A Lonely Heath, The Red Lion, The Highway. It was 11:30 before the Spruce, with Mount Clare and Sol Chickerell on board, had steamed back again to Sandbourne. The direction and increase of the wind had made it necessary to keep the vessel still further to sea on their return than in going, that they might clear without risk the windy, sousing, thwacking, basting, scourging jack-ketch of a corner called Old Harry Point, which lay about half-way along their track, and stood, with its detached posts and stumps of white rock, like a skeleton's lower jaw, grinning at British navigation. Here strong currents and cross-currents were beginning to interweave their scrolls and meshes, the water rising behind them in tumultuous heaps and slanging against the fronts and angles of cliffs, whence it flew into the air like clouds of flour. Who could now believe that this roaring abode of chaos smiled in the sun as gently as an infant during the summer days not long gone by, every pinnacle, crag, and cave returning a doubled image across the glassy sea? They were now again at Sandbourne, a point in their journey reached more than 4 hours ago. It became necessary to consider anew how to accomplish the difficult remainder. The wind was not blowing much beyond what seamen call half a gale, but there had been enough unpleasantness afloat to make landsmen glad to get ashore, and this dissipated in a slight measure their vexation at having failed in their purpose. Still, Mountclair loudly cursed their confidence in that treacherously short route, and Sol abused the unknown Sandbourne man who had brought the news of the steamer's arrival to them at the junction. The only course left open to them now, short of giving up the undertaking, was to go by the road along the shore, which, curving round the various little creeks and inland seas between their present position and Nancy, was of no less length than 30 miles. There was no train back to the junction till the next morning, and Sol's proposition that they should drive thither in hope of meeting the mail train was overruled by Mountclair. "We will have nothing more to do with chance," he said. "We may miss the train, and then we shall have gone out of the way for nothing. More than that, the down mail does not stop till it gets several miles beyond the nearest station for Nancy, so it's hopeless." "If there'd only been a telegraph to the confounded place." "Telegraph? We might as well telegraph to the devil as to an old booby and a damned scheming young widow. I very much question if we should do anything in the matter, even if we get there. But I suppose we'd better go on now." "You can do as you like. I shall go on, if I have to walk every step of it." "That's not necessary. I think the best posting-house at this end of the town is Tempit's. We must knock them up at once. Which will you do? Attempt supper here, or break the back of our journey first, and get on to Anglebury? We may rest an hour or two there, unless you feel really in want of a meal." "No, I'll leave eating to merrier men who have no sister in the hands of a cursed old vandal." "Very well," said Mountclair. "We'll go on at once." An additional half-hour elapsed before they were fairly started, the lateness and abruptness of their arrival causing delay in getting a conveyance ready. The tempestuous night had apparently driven the whole town, gentle and simple, early to their beds, and when at length the travellers were on their way, the aspect of the weather grew yet more forbidding. The rain came down unmercifully. The booming wind caught it, bore it across the plain, whizzed it against the carriage like a sower sowing his seed. It was precisely such weather, and almost at the same season, as when Picardy traversed the same moor, stricken with her great disappointment at not meeting Christopher Julian. Further on for several miles, the drive lay through an open heath, dotted occasionally with fir plantations, the trees of which told the tale of their species without help from outline or colour. They spoke in those melancholy moans and sobs which give to their sound a solemn sadness surpassing even that of the sea. From each carriage-lamp the long rays stretched like feelers into the air, and somewhat cheered the way, until the insidious damp that pervaded all things above, around, and underneath overpowered one of them, and rendered every attempt to rekindle it ineffectual. Even had the two men's dislike to each other's society been less, the general din of the night would have prevented much talking. As it was, they sat in a rigid reticence that was almost a third personality. The roads were laid hereabouts with a light sandy gravel, which, though not clogging, was soft and friable. It speedily became saturated, and the wheels ground heavily and deeply into its substance. At length, after crossing from 10 to 12 miles of these eternal heaths under the eternally drumming storm, they could discern islets of light winking to them in the distance from under a nebulous brow of pale haze. They were looking on the little town of Havenpool. Soon after this, crossroads were reached, one of which, at right angles to their present direction, led them down to the left to that place. Here the man stopped and informed them that the horses would be able to go but a mile or two further.
"Oh, very well, we must have others that can," Mountclair. "Does our way lie through the town?"
"No, sir, unless we go there to change horses, which I thought to do. The direct road is straight on. Havenpool lies about 3 miles down there on the left, but the water is over the road, and we had better go round. We should come to no place for 2 or 3 miles, and then only to Flychit."
"What's Flychit like?"
"Oh, a very small bit of a village."
"Still, I think we had better push on," said Sol. "I'm against running the risk of finding the way flooded about Havenpool."
"So am I," returned Mountclair.
"I know a wheelwright in Flitchit," continued Sol, "and he keeps a beer house and owns 2 horses. We could hire them and have a bit of summits in the shape of victuals, and then get on to Anglebury. Perhaps the rain may hold up by that time. Anything's better than going out of our way."
"Yes, and the horses can last out to that place," said Mountclair. "Up and on again, my man."
On they went towards Flychit. Still the everlasting heath, the black hills bulging against the sky, the barrows upon their round summits like warts on a swarthy skin. The storm blew huskily over bushes of heather and furze that it was unable materially to disturb, and the travellers proceeded as before. But the horses were now far from fresh, and the time spent in reaching the next village was quite half as long as that taken up by the previous heavy portion of the drive. When they entered Flychit, it was about 3.
"Now, where's the inn?" said Mountclair, yawning.
"Oh, just on the Nap," Sol answered. "'Tis a little small place, and we must do as well as we can." They pulled up before a cottage, upon the whitewashed front of which could be seen a square board representing the sign. After an infinite labour of rapping and shouting, a casement opened overhead, and a woman's voice inquired what was the matter. Sol explained, when she told them that the horses were away from home.
"Now we must wait till these are rested," growled Mountclair. "A pretty muddle."
"Cannot be helped," answered Sol, and he asked the woman to open the door. She replied that her husband was away with the horses and van, and that they could not come in. Sol was known to her, and he mentioned his name, but the woman only began to abuse him.
"Come, publican, you'd better let us in, or we'll have the law for it," rejoined Sol, with more spirit. "You don't dare to keep nobility waiting like this."
"Nobility?"
"My mate have the title of honourable, whether or no. Let's have some none of your slack," said Sol.
"Don't be a fool, young chopstick," exclaimed Mountclair. "Get the door opened."
"I will in my own way," said Sol testily. "You mustn't mind my trading upon your qualities. 'Tis a case of necessity. This is a woman nothing will bring to reason but an appeal to the higher powers. If every man of title was as useful as you are tonight, sir, I'd never call them lumber again as long as I live."
"How singular!"
There's never a bit of rubbish that won't come in use if you keep it 7 years.
"If my utility depends upon keeping you company, may I go to hell for lacking every atom of the virtue."
"Hear, hear! But it hardly is becoming in me to answer up to a man so much older than I, or I could say more. Suppose we draw a line here for the present, sir, and get indoors."
"Oh, do what you will in heaven's name."
A few more words to the woman resulted in her agreeing to admit them if they would attend to themselves afterwards. This Sol promised, and the key of the door was let down to them from the bedroom window by a string. When they had entered, Sol, who knew the house well, busied himself in lighting a fire, the driver going off with a lantern to the stable, where he found standing room for the 2 horses. Mountclair walked up and down the kitchen, mumbling words of disgust at the situation, the few of this kind that he let out being just enough to show what a fearfully large number he kept in.
"According to people at this time of morning,"
the woman occasionally exclaimed down the stairs.
"But folks show no mercy upon their flesh and blood, not one bit or mite."
"Now never be stomachy, my good soul,"
cried Sol from the fireplace, where he stood blowing the fire with his breath.
"Only tell me where the victuals bide, and I'll do all the cooking. We'll pay like princes, especially me mate."
"There's but little in the house," said the sleepy woman from her bedroom. "There's pig's fry, a side of bacon, a conger eel, and pickled onions."
"Conger eel?" said Sol to Mountclair. "No, thank you."
"Pig's fry?"
"No, thank you."
"Well, then, tell me where the bacon is," shouted Sol to the woman.
"You must find it,"
came again down the stairs. "'Tis somewhere up in Gimley, but in which part I can't mind. Really, I don't know whether I be upon my head or my heels, and my brain is all in a spin with being rafted up in such a larry."
"Bide where you be, there's a dear," said Sol.
"We'll do it all. Just tell us where the tea-caddy is and the gridiron, and then you can go to sleep again."
The woman appeared to take his advice, for she gave the information, and silence soon reigned upstairs. When one piece of bacon had been with difficulty cooked over the newly lit fire, Sol said to Mountclair, with the rasher on his fork, "Now look here, sir. I think while I'm making the tea you ought to go on griddling some more of these, as you haven't done nothing at all."
"I do the paying."
"Oh, well, give me the bacon. And when you've done yours, I'll cook the man's, as the poor fellow's hungry, I make no doubt." Mountclair, fork in hand, then began with his rasher, tossing it about the gridiron in masterly style, Sol attending to the tea. He was attracted from this occupation by a brilliant flame up the chimney, Mountclair exclaiming, "Now the cursed thing is on fire!" "Blow it out hard, that's it. Well now, sir, do you come and begin upon mine, as you must be hungry. I'll finish the griddling. Ought we to mind the man sitting down in our company, as there's no other room for him? I hear him coming in."
"Oh, no, not at all. Put him over that table."
"And I'll join him. You can sit here by yourself, sir." The meal was dispatched, and the coachman again retired, promising to have the horses ready in about an hour and a half. Sol and Mountclair made themselves comfortable upon each side of the fireplace, since there was no remedy for the delay. After sitting in silence a while, they nodded and slept. How long they would have remained thus, in consequence of their fatigues, there is no telling, had not the mistress of the cottage descended the stairs about 2 hours later, after peeping down upon them at intervals of 5 minutes during their sleep, lest they should leave without her knowledge. It was 6 o'clock, and Sol went out for the man, whom he found snoring in the hayloft. There was now real necessity for haste, and in 10 minutes they were again on their way. Day dawned upon the Red Lion Inn at Anglebury with a timid and watery eye. From the shadowy archway came a shining lantern, which was seen to be dangling from the hand of a little bow-legged old man, the hostler, John. Having reached the front, he looked around to measure the daylight, opened the lantern, and extinguished it by a pinch of his fingers. He paused for a moment to have the customary word or two with his neighbour the milkman, who usually appeared at this point at this time. "It sounds like the whistle of the morning train," the milkman said as he drew near, a scream from the further end of the town reaching their ears. "Well, I hope now the wind's in that quarter we shan't have a little more fine weather, eh, ostler? What you be a-talking o'? Can you hear the whistle plain, I say?" "Oh, I suppose you do, but faith, 'tis a poor fist I can make at hearing anything. There, I could have told you all the same that the wind was in the east, even if I had not seen poor Thomas Tribble's smoke blowing across the little orchard. Joints be a true weathercock enough when past 60. These easterly rains, when they do come, which is not often, come with might enough to squail a man into his grave. Well, we must look for it, ostler. Why, what mighty equipage is this, come to town at such a pur-blinking time of day?" "'Tis what time only can tell, though 'twill not be long first," the hostler replied, as the driver of the pair of horses and carriage containing Sol and Mountclair slackened pace and drew rein before the inn. Fresh horses were immediately called for, and, while they were being put in, the two travellers walked up and down. "It is now 7:15, said Mountclair, and the question arises, shall I go on to Nulsea, or branch off at Corvesgate Castle for Enkworth? I think the best plan will be to drive first to Enkworth, set me down, and then get him to take you on at once to Nulsea. What do you say?" "When shall I reach Nulsea by that arrangement?"
"By 8:30. We shall be at Enkworth before 8, which is excellent time."
"Very well, sir, I agree to that," said Sol, feeling that as soon as one of the two birds had been caught, the other could not mate without their knowledge. The carriage and horses being again ready, away they drove at once, both having by this time grown too restless to spend in Anglebury a minute more than was necessary. The hostler and his lad had taken the jaded Sandbourne horses to the stable, rubbed them down, and fed them, when another noise was heard outside the yard. The omnibus had returned from meeting the train. Relinquishing the horses to the small stable lad, the old hostler again looked out from the arch. A young man had stepped from the omnibus, and he came forward. "I want a conveyance of some sort to take me to Knowlesea at once. Can you get a horse harnessed in 5 minutes?" "I'll make shift to do what I can, master, not promising about the minutes. The truest man can say no more. Won't you step into the bar, sir, and give your order? I'll let you know as soon as 'tis ready." Christopher turned into a room smelling strongly of the night before, and stood by the newly kindled fire to wait. He had just come in haste from Melchester. The upshot of his excitement about the wedding, which, as the possible hour of its solemnization drew near, had increased till it bore him on like a wind, was this unpremeditated journey. Lying awake the previous night, the hangings of his bed pulsing to every beat of his heart, he decided that there was one last and great service which it behoved him, as an honest man and friend, to say nothing of lover, to render to Ethelberta at this juncture. It was to ask her by some means whether or not she had engaged with open eyes to marry Lord Mountclair, and, if not, to give her a word or two of enlightenment. That done, she might be left to take care of herself. His plan was to obtain an interview with Pickety and learn from her accurately the state of things. Should he by any possibility be mistaken in his belief as to the contracting parties, a knowledge of the mistake would be cheaply purchased by the journey. Should he not, he would send up to Ethelberta the strong note of expostulation which was already written and waiting in his pocket. To intrude upon her at such a time was unseemly, and to dispatch a letter by a messenger before evidence of its necessity had been received was most undesirable. The whole proceeding at best was clumsy, yet earnestness is mostly clumsy, and how could he let the event pass without a protest? Before daylight on that autumn morning he had risen, told Faith of his intention, and started off. As soon as the vehicle was ready, Christopher hastened to the door and stepped up. The little stable-boy led the horse a few paces on the way before relinquishing his hold. At the same moment, a respectably dressed man, on foot, with a small black bag in his hand, came up from the opposite direction, along the street leading from the railway. He was a thin, elderly man, with grey hair. That a great anxiety pervaded him was as plainly visible as were his features. Without entering the inn, he came up at once to old John. "Have you anything going to Knowlesea this morning that I can get a lift in?" said the pedestrian. No other than Ethelberta's father. "Oh, nothing empty that I know of." "Or carrier?" "No." "A matter of 15 shillings, then, I suppose?" "Yes, no doubt, but there's a young man just now starting. He might not take it ill if you were to ask him for a seat, and go halves in the hour of the trap. Shall I call out?" "Ah, do." The hostler bawled to the stable-boy, who put the question to Christopher. There was room for 2 in the dog-cart, and Julian had no objection to save the shillings of a fellow-traveller who was evidently not rich. When Chickerell mounted to his seat, Christopher paused to look at him, as we pause with some enactment that seems to have been already before us in a dream long ago. Ethelberta's face was there, as the landscape is in the map, the romance in the history, the aim in the deed, denuded, rayless, and sorry, but discernible. For the moment, however, this did not occur to Julian. He took the whip, the boy loosed his hold upon the horse, and they proceeded on their way. "What slapdash jinks may there be going on at Knowlesea, then, me sonny?" said the hostler to the lad, as the dog-cart and the backs of the 2 men diminished on the road. "You be a Knowlesea boy. Have anything reached your young ears about what's in the wind there, David Straw?" Nothing, except that 'tis going to be Christmas Day in 5 weeks, and then a hide-bound bull is going to be killed if he don't die afore the time, and given away by my lord in 3-pound chunks, as a reward to good people who never curse and sing bad songs, except when they be drunk. Mother says perhaps she will have some, and 'tis excellent if well stewed, mother says." "A very fair chronicle for a boy to give, but not what I asked for. When you try to answer an old man's question, always bear in mind what it was that old man asked. A hide-bound bull is good when well stewed, I make no doubt, for they who like it. But that's not it. What I said was, do you know why 3 folks, a rich man, a middling man, and a poor man, She want horses for Nolsey afore 7 o'clock in the morning on a blinking day in fall, when everything is as wet as a dish-clout, whereas that's more than often happens in fine summer weather." "No, I don't know, John Ostler." "Then go home and tell your mother that ye be no wide-awake boy, and that old John, who went to school with her father afore she was born or thought of, says so. Choke it all, why should I think there's summat going on at Nolsey? Honest travelling has been so rascally abused since I was a boy in Pinners, by tribes of nobodies tearing from one end of the country to t'other, to see the sun go down in salt water, or the moon play jack-lantern behind some rotten tar or other, that upon my song, when life and death's in the wind, there's no telling the difference." "I'll have their sixpences ever so much." "Young sonny, don't you answer up to me when you bain't been in the story, stopping my words in that fashion. I won't have it, David. Now up in the turret with ye, there's a good boy, and down with another lock or two of hay, as fast as you can do it for me." The boy vanished under the archway, and the hostler followed at his heels. Meanwhile the carriage bearing Mr. Mountclair and Sol was speeding on its way to Enkworth. When they reached the spot at which the road forked into two, they left the Nolsey route, and, keeping thence under the hills for the distance of 5 or 6 miles, drove into Lord Mountclair's park. In 10 minutes the house was before them, framed in by dripping trees. Mountclair jumped out and entered without ceremony. Sol, being anxious to know if Lord Mountclair was there, ordered the coachman to wait a few moments. It was now nearly 8 o'clock, and the smoke which ascended from the newly lit fires of the court painted soft blue tints upon the brown and golden leaves of lofty boughs adjoining. "Oh, Ethelberta," said Sol, as he regarded the fair prospect. The gravel of the drive had been washed clean and smooth by the night's rain, but there were fresh wheel marks other than their own upon the track. Yet the mansion seemed scarcely awake, and stillness reigned everywhere around. Not more than 3 or 4 minutes had passed when the door was opened for Mountclair, and he came hastily from the doorsteps. "I must go on with you," he said, getting into the vehicle. "He's gone." "Where, to Nolsey?" said Sol. "Yes," said Mountclair. "Now go ahead to Nolsey," he shouted to the man. "To think I should be fooled like this! I had no idea that he would be leaving so soon. We might perhaps have been here an hour earlier by hard striving. But who was to dream that he would arrange to leave it at such an unearthly time of the morning at this dark season of the year? Drive! Drive!" he called again out of the window, and the pace was increased. "I've come 2 or 3 miles out of my way on account of you," said Sol suddenly, "and all this time lost. I don't see why you wanted to come here at all. I knew it would be a waste of time." "Damn it all, man," said Mountclair, "it is no use for you to be angry with me." "I think it is. 'Tis you have brought me into this muddle," said Sol, in no sweeter tone. "Ha! Ha! Upon my life, I should be inclined to laugh if I were not so much inclined to do the other thing. A Berta's trick of trying to make close family allies of such a cantankerous pair as you and I. So much of one mind as we be, so alike in our ways of living, so close connected in our callings and principles, so matched in manners and customs. 'Twould be 1,000 pities to part us, eh, Mr. Mountclair?" Mountclair faintly laughed with the same hideous merriment at the same idea, and then both remained in a withering silence, meant to express the utter contempt of each for the other, both in family and in person. They passed the lodge, and again swept into the high road. "Drive on," said Mountclair, putting his head again out of the window, and shouting to the man. "Drive like the devil!" he roared again a few minutes afterwards, in fuming dissatisfaction with their rate of progress. "Bain't I doing of it?" said the driver, turning angrily round. "I ain't going to ruin my governor's horses for strangers who won't pay double for them, not I. I'm driving as fast as I can. If other folks get in the way with their traps, I suppose I must drive round 'em, sir." There was a slight crash. "There," continued the coachman, "that's what comes of my turning round." Sol looked out on the other side, and found that the fore-wheel of their carriage had become locked in the wheel of a dog-cart they had overtaken, the road here being very narrow. Their coachman, who knew he was to blame for this mishap, felt the advantage of taking time by the forelock in a case of accusation, and began swearing at his victim as if he were the sinner. Sol jumped out, and looking up at the occupants of the other conveyance, saw against the sky the back elevation of his father and Christopher Julian, sitting upon a little seat which they overhung like two big puddings upon a small dish.
"Father! What, are you going?" said Sol. "Is it about Berta that you've come?"
"Yes, I got your letter," said Chickerell, "and felt I should like to come, that I ought to come to save her from what she'll regret. Luckily, this gentleman, a stranger to me, has given me a lift from Anglebury, or I must have hard." He pointed to Christopher.
"But he's Mr. Julian," said Sol. "You are Mrs. Petherwin's father? I have travelled in your company without knowing it," exclaimed Christopher, feeling and looking both astonished and puzzled. At first it had appeared to him that, in direct antagonism to his own purpose, her friends were favouring Ethelberta's wedding, but it was evidently otherwise. "Yes, that's father," said Sol. "Father, this is Mr. Julian. Mr. Julian, this gentleman here is Lord Mountclair's brother, and to cut the story short, we all wish to stop the wedding."
"Then let us get on, in heaven's sake," said Mountclair. "You the lady's father?"
"I am,"
said Chickerell. "Then you'd better come into this carriage. We shall go faster than the dog-cart. Now, driver, are the wheels right again?" Chickerell hastily entered with Mountclair. Sol joined them, and they sped on. Christopher drove close in their rear, not quite certain whether he did well in going further, now that there were plenty of people to attend to the business, but anxious to see the end. The other three sat in silence, with their eyes upon their knees, though the clouds were dispersing, and the morning grew bright. In about 20 minutes the square, unembattled tower of Knowlsea Church appeared below them in the vale, its summit just touching the distant line of sea upon sky. The element by which they had been victimized on the previous evening now smiled falsely to the low morning sun. They descended the road to the village at a little more mannerly pace than that of the earlier journey, and saw the raised glance upon the Chapter 45 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 45. Knowlsea, the road thence, Enkworth. All eyes were directed to the church gate as the travellers descended the hill. No wedding carriages were there, no favours, no slatternly group of women brimming with interest, no aged pauper on 2 sticks who comes because he has nothing else to do till dying time, no nameless female passing by on the other side with a laugh of indifference, no ringers taking off their coats as they vanish up a turret, no hobbledehoys on tiptoe outside the chancel windows. In short, none whatever of the customary accessories of a country wedding was anywhere visible.
"Thank God," said Chickerell.
"Wait till you know he deserves it," said Mountclair.
"Nothing's done yet between them."
"It is not likely that anything is done at this time of day. But I've decided to go to the church first. You will probably go to your relative's house at once?"
Sol looked to his father for her reply. "No, I too shall go to the church first, just to assure myself," said Chickerell. "I shall then go on to Mrs. Petherwin's."
The carriage was stopped at the corner of a steep incline leading down to the edifice. Mountclair and Chickerell alighted and walked on towards the gates, Sol remaining in his place. Christopher was some way off, descending the hill on foot, having halted to leave his horse and trap at a small inn at the entrance to the village. When Chickerell and Mountclair reached the churchyard gate, they found it slightly open. The church door beyond it was also open, but nobody was near the spot. "We've arrived not a minute too soon, however," said Mountclair. "Preparations have apparently begun. It was to be an early wedding, no doubt." Entering the building, they looked around. It was quite empty. Chickerell turned towards the chancel, his eye being attracted by a red kneeling cushion placed at about the middle of the altar railing, as if for early use. Mountclair strode to the vestry, somewhat at a loss how to proceed in his difficult task of unearthing his brother, obtaining a private interview with him, and then, by the introduction of Sol and Chickerell, causing a general convulsion. "Ah, there's somebody," he said, observing a man in the vestry. He advanced with the intention of asking where Lord Mountclair was to be found. Chickerell came forward in the same direction. "Are you the parish clerk?" said Mountclair to the man, who was dressed up in his best clothes.
"I have the honour of that calling," the man replied.
Two large books were lying before him on the vestry table, one of them being open. As the clerk spoke, he looked slantingly on the page, as a person might do to discover if some writing were dry. Mountclair and Chickerell gazed on the same page. The book was the marriage register. "Too late," said Chickerell. There, plainly enough, stood the signatures of Lord Mountclair and Ethelberta. The Viscount's was very black and had not yet dried. Her strokes were firm and comparatively thick for a woman's, though pale by juxtaposition with her husband's muddled characters. In the space for witnesses' names appeared in trembling lines as fine as silk the autograph of Pickety, the second name being that of a stranger, probably the clerk. Yes, we are too late, it seems," said Mountclair coolly. "Who could have thought they'd marry at 8? Chickerell stood like a man baked hard and dry. Further than his first two words he could say nothing. "They must have said about it early, upon my soul," Mountclair continued. "When did the wedding take place?" he asked of the clerk sharply. "It was over about 5 minutes before you came in," replied that luminary pleasantly, as he played at an invisible game of pitch and toss with some half-sovereigns in his pocket. "I received orders to have the church ready at 5 minutes to 8 this morning, though I knew nothing about such a thing till bedtime last night. It was very private and plain. Not that I should mind another such a one, sir." And he secretly pitched and tossed again. Meanwhile Sol had found himself too restless to sit waiting in the carriage for more than a minute after the other two had left it. He stepped out at the same instant that Christopher came past, and together they went on to the church. "Father, ought we not to go on at once to Ethelberta's instead of waiting?" said Sol, on reaching the vestry, still in ignorance. "'Twas no use in coming here." "No use at all," said Chickerell, as he had straw in his throat. "Look at this. I would almost have soon have had it that in leaving this church I came from her grave. Well, no, perhaps not that, but I fear it is a bad thing." Sol then saw the names in the register, Christopher saw them, and the man closed the book. Christopher could not well command himself, and he retired. "I knew it. I always said that pride would lead Berta to marry an unworthy man, and so it has," said Sol bitterly. "What shall we do now? I'll see her." "Do no such thing, young man," said Mountclair. "The best course is to leave matters alone. They are married. If you are wise, you will try to think the match a good one, and be content to let her keep her position without inconveniencing her by your intrusions or complaints. It is possible that the satisfaction of her ambition will help her to endure any few surprises to her propriety that may occur. She is a clever young woman, and has played her cards adroitly. I only hope she may never repent of the game. Good morning." Saying this, Mountclair slightly bowed to his relations, and marched out of the church with dignity. But it was told afterwards by the coachman, who had no love for Mountclair, that, when he stepped into the fly, and was, as he believed, unobserved, he was quite overcome with fatuous rage, his lips frothing like a mug of hot ale. "What an impertinent gentleman 'tis," said Chickerell, "as if we had tried for her to marry his brother." "He knows better than that," said Sol, "but he'd never believe that Berta didn't lay a trap for the old fellow. He thinks at this moment that Lord Mountclair had never been told of us and our belongings." "I wonder if she's deceived him in anything," murmured Chickerell. "I can hardly suppose it, but she is altogether beyond me. However, if she has misled him on any point, she will suffer for it." "You need not fear that, father. It isn't her way of working. Why couldn't she have known that when a title is to be had for the asking, the owner must be a shocking one indeed?" "The title is well enough. Any poor scrubs in our place must be fools not to think the match a very rare and astonishing honour, as far as the position goes. But that my brave girl will be miserable is a part of the honour I can't stomach so well. If he'd been any other lord in the kingdom, we might have been merry indeed. I believe he will ruin her happiness. Yes, I do. Not by any personal snubbing or rough conduct, but by other things, causing her to be despised, and that is the thing she can't endure. She's not to be despised without a deal of trouble, we must remember that. And if he insults her by introducing new favourites, as they say he did his first wife,
I'll call upon him and ask his meaning, and take her away." "Nonsense. We shall never know what he does, or how she feels. She will never let out a word. However unhappy she may be, she will always deny it. That's the unfortunate part of such marriages." "An old chap like that ought to leave young women alone, damn him." The clerk came nearer. "I'm afraid I cannot allow bad words to be spoken in this sacred pile," he said. "As far as my personal self goes, I should have no objection to your cussing as much as you like, but as an official of the church my conscience won't allow it to be done." "Your conscience has allowed something to be done that cussing and swearing are godly worship to." "The prettiest maid is left out of harness, however," said the clerk. "The little witness was the chicken to my taste. Lord forgive me for saying it, and a man with a wife and family." Sol and his father turned to withdraw, and soon forgot the remark, but it was frequently recalled by Christopher. "Do you think of trying to see Ethelberta before you leave?" said Sol. "Certainly not," said Chickerell. "Mr. Mountclair's advice was good in that. The more we keep out of the way, the more good we are doing her. I shall go back to Anglebury by the carrier and get on at once to London. You'll go with me, I suppose?" "The carrier does not leave yet for an hour or two." "I shall walk on and let him overtake me. If possible, I will get one glimpse of Enkworth Court, Berta's new home. There may be time if I start at once." "I'll walk with you," said Sol. "There is room for one with me," said Christopher. "I shall drive back early in the afternoon." "Thank you," said Sol. "I will endeavour to meet you at Corvsgate." Thus it was arranged. Chickerell could have wished to search for Picketty and learn from her the details of this mysterious matter, but it was particularly painful to him to make himself busy after the event, and to appear suddenly and uselessly where he was plainly not wanted to appear would be an awkwardness which the pleasure of seeing either daughter could scarcely counterbalance. Hence he had resolved to return at once to town, and there await the news, together with the detailed directions as to his own future movements, carefully considered and laid down, which were sure to be given by the far-seeing Ethelberta. Sol and his father walked on together, Chickerell to meet the carrier just beyond Enkworth, Sol to wait for Christopher at Corvsgate. His wish to see, in company with his father, the outline of the seat to which Ethelberta had been advanced that day, was the triumph of youthful curiosity and interest over dogged objection. His father's wish was based on calmer reasons. Christopher, lone and out of place, remained in the church yet a little longer. He desultorily walked around. Reaching the organ-chamber, he looked at the instrument and was surprised to find behind it a young man. Julian first thought him to be the organist. On second inspection, however, he proved to be a person Christopher had met before, under far different circumstances. It was our young friend Ladywell, looking as sick and sorry as a lily with a slug in its stalk. The occasion, the place, and their own condition made them kin. Christopher had despised Ladywell. Ladywell had disliked Christopher. But a third item neutralized the other two. It was their common lot. Christopher just nodded, for they had only met on Ethelberta's stairs. Ladywell nodded more and spoke. "The church appears to be interesting," he said. "Yes, such a tower is rare in England," said Christopher. They then dwelt on other features of the building, thence enlarging to the village, and then to the rocks and marine scenery, both avoiding the malady they suffered from, the marriage of Ethelberta. "The village streets are very picturesque, and the cliff scenery is good of its kind," rejoined Ladywell. "The rocks represent the feminine side of grandeur. Here they are white, with delicate tops. On the west coast they are higher, black, and with angular summits. These represent grandeur in its masculine aspect. It's merely my own idea, and not very bright, perhaps." "It is very ingenious," said Christopher, "and perfectly true." Ladywell was pleased. "I am here at present making sketches for my next subject, a winter sea. Otherwise I should not have happened to be in the church." "You are acquainted with Lady Prethwin. I think you are Mr. Ladywell, who painted her portrait last season." "Yes," said Ladywell, colouring. You may have heard her speak of Mr. Julian."
"Oh, yes,"
said Ladywell, offering his hand. Then by degrees their tongues wound closer round the subject of their sadness, each tacitly owning to what he would not tell. "I saw it," said Ladywell heavily. "Did she look troubled?" "Not in the least. Bright and fresh as a May morning. She's played me many a bitter trick, and poor Nay, too, a friend of mine, but I cannot help forgiving her. I saw a carriage at the door and strolled in. The ceremony was just proceeding, so I sat down here. Well, I have done with Nulsea. The place has no further interest for me now. I may own to you as a friend that if she had not been living here I should have studied at some other coast. Of course, that's in confidence." "I understand, quite. I only arrived in the neighbourhood 2 days ago, and did not set eyes upon her till this morning. She kept so entirely indoors." Then the young men parted, and half an hour later the ingenuous Ladywell came from the visitors' inn by the shore, a man walking behind him with a quantity of artists' materials and appliances. He went on board the steamer, which this morning had performed the passage in safety. Ethelberta single having been the lodestone in the cliffs that had attracted Ladywell hither, Ethelberta married was the negative pole of the same, sending him away. And thus did a woman put an end to the only opportunity of distinction, on art exhibition walls, that ever offered itself to the tortuous ways, quaint alleys, and marbled bluffs of Nulsea, as accessories in the picture of a winter sea. Christopher's interest in the village was of the same evaporating nature. He looked upon the sea, and the great swell, and the waves sending up a sound like the huzzas of multitudes, but all the wild scene was irksome now. The ocean-bound steamers far away on the horizon inspired him with no curiosity as to their destination. The house Ethelberta had occupied was positively hateful, and he turned away to wait impatiently for the hour at which he had promised to drive on to meet Sol at Colesgate. Sol and Chickerell plodded along the road, in order to skirt Enkworth before the carrier came up. Reaching the top of a hill on their way, they paused to look down on a peaceful scene. It was a park and wood, glowing in all the matchless colours of late autumn, parapets and pediments peering out from a central position afar. At the bottom of the descent before them was a lodge, to which they now descended. The gate stood invitingly open. Exclusiveness was no part of the owner's instincts. One could see that at a glance. No appearance of a well-rolled garden path attached to the park drive, as is the case with many, betokening by the perfection of their services the proprietor's deficiency in hospitality. The approach was like a turnpike road full of great ruts, clumsy mendings, bordered by trampled edges and incursions upon the grass at pleasure. Butchers and bakers drove as freely herein as peers and peeresses. Christening parties, wedding companies, and funeral trains passed along by the doors of the mansion without check or question. A wild untidiness in this particular has its own recommendations, for guarded grounds ever convey a suspicion that their owner is young to landed possessions, as religious earnestness implies newness of conversion, and conjugal tenderness recent marriage. Half an hour being wanting as yet to Chickerell's time with the carrier, Sol and himself, like the rest of the world when at leisure, walked into the extensive stretch of grass and grove. It formed a park so large that not one of its owners had ever wished it larger, not one of its owner's rivals had ever failed to wish it smaller, and not one of its owner's satellites has ever seen it without praise. They somewhat avoided the roadway, passing under the huge, misshapen, ragged trees, and through fern brakes, ruddy and crisp in their decay. On reaching a suitable eminence, the father and son stood still to look upon the many-chimneyed building, or rather conglomeration of buildings, to which these groves and glades formed a setting. "We will just give a glance," said Chickerell, "and then go away. It don't seem well to me that Ethelberta should have this. It is too much. The sudden change will do her no good. I never believe in anything that comes in the shape of wonderful luck. As it comes, so it goes. Had she been brought home to-day to one of those tenant farms instead of these woods and walls, I could have called it good fortune.
What she should have done was glorify herself by glorifying her own line of life, not by forsaking that line for another. Better have been admired as a governess than shunned as a peeress, which is what she will be. But it is just the same everywhere in these days. Young men will rather wear a black coat and starve than wear fustian and do well. One man to want such a monstrous house as that. Well, 'tis a fine place. See, there's the carpenter's shops, the timber yard, and everything, as if it were a little town. Perhaps Berta may hire me for a job now and then. I always knew she would cut herself off from us. She marked for it from childhood, and she has finished the business thoroughly. Well, it's no matter, father, for why should we want to trouble her? She may write, and I shall answer. But if she calls to see me, I shall not return the visit. And if she meets me with her husband or any other unused society about her, I shall behave as a stranger. It will be best, said Chickerell. Well, now I must move. However, by the sorcery of accident, before they had very far retraced their steps, an open carriage became visible round a bend in the drive. Chickerell, with a servant's instinct, was for beating a retreat. "No," said Saul, "let us stand our ground. We have already been seen, and we do no harm." So they stood still on the edge of the drive, and the carriage drew near. It was a landau, and the sun shone in upon Lord Mountclair, with Lady Mountclair sitting beside him, like Abishag beside King David. Very blithe looked the Viscount, for he rode upon a cherub to-day. She appeared fresh, rosy, and strong, but dubious. Though if Meehan was anything, she was a viscountess twice over. Her dress was of a dove-coloured material, with a bonnet to match, a little tufted white feather resting on the top, like a truce flag between the blood of noble and vassal. Upon the cool grey of her shoulders hung a few locks of hair, toned warm as fire by the sunshiny addition to its natural hue. Chickerell instinctively took off his hat. Saul did the same. For only a moment did Ethelberta seem uncertain how to act, but a solution to her difficulty was given by the face of her brother. There she saw plainly, at one glance, more than a dozen speeches would have told. For Saul's features thoroughly expressed his intention that to him she was to be a stranger. Her eyes flew to Chickerell, and he slightly shook his head. She understood them now. With a tear in her eye for her father, and a sigh in her bosom for Saul, she bowed in answer to their salute. Her husband moved his hat and nodded, and the carriage rolled on. Lord Mountclair might possibly be making use of the fine morning and showing her the park and premises. Chickerell, with a moist eye, now went on with his son towards the high road. When they reached the lodge keeper was walking in the sun, smoking his pipe. "Good morning," he said to Chickerell. "Any rejoicings at the court to-day?" the butler inquired. "Quite the reverse. Not a soul there. 'Tisn't known anywhere at all. I had no idea of such a thing till he brought my lady here. Not going off neither. They've come home like the commonest couple in the land, and not even the bells allowed to ring." They walked along the public road, and the carrier came in view. "Father," said Saul, "I don't think I'll go further with you. She's gone into the house, and suppose she should run back without him to try to find us. It would be cruel to disappoint her. I'll bide about here for a quarter of an hour, in case she should. Mr. Julian won't have passed Corvsgate till I get there." "Well, one or two of her old ways may be left in her still, and it is not a bad thought. Then you will walk the rest of the distance if you don't meet Mr. Julian?" "I must be in London by the evening." "Any time tonight will do for me. I shall not begin work until tomorrow, so that the 4 o'clock train will answer my purpose." Thus they parted, and Saul strolled leisurely back. The road was quite deserted, and he lingered by the park fence. "Saul," said a bird-like voice, "how did you come here?" He looked up, and saw a figure peering down upon him from the top of the park wall, the ground on the inside being higher than the road.
The speaker was to the expected Ethelberta what the moon is to the sun, a star to the moon. It was Pickety.
"Hello, Pickety," said Sol.
"There's a little gate a quarter of a mile further on," said Pickety. "We can meet there without your passing through the big lodge. I'll be there as soon as you." Sol ascended the hill, passed through the second gate, and turned back again, when he met Pickety coming forward under the trees. They walked together in this secluded spot. "Berta says she wanted to see you and father," said Pickety breathlessly. "You must come in and make yourselves comfortable. She had no idea you were here so secretly, and she didn't know what to do."
"Father's gone,"
said Sol. "How vexed she will be! She thinks there's something the matter, that you are angry with her for not telling you earlier. But you will come in, Sol?"
"No, I can't come in," said her brother.
"Why not? It's such a big house, you can't think. You do not come near the front apartments if you think we should be ashamed of you in your working clothes. How came you not to dress up a bit, Sol? Still, Berta won't mind it much. She says Lord Mountclair must take her as she is, or he is kindly welcome to leave her."
"Ah, well, I might have had a word or two to say about that, but the time has gone by for it, worse luck. Perhaps it is best that I have said nothing, and she has had her way. No, I shan't come in, Pickety. Father is gone, and I'm going too."
"Oh, Sol!"
"We are rather put out at her acting like this, father and I, and all of us. She might have let us know about it beforehand, even if she is a lady and we what we always was. It wouldn't have let her down so terrible much to write a line. She might have learnt something that would have led her to take a different step."
"But you will see poor Berta. She has done no harm. She was going to write long letters to all of you to-day, explaining her wedding, and how she's going to help us all on in the world."
Sol paused irresolutely. "No, I won't come in," he said. "It would disgrace her, for one thing, dressed as I be. More than that, I don't want to come in. But I should like to see her if she would like to see me, and I'll go up there to that little fir plantation and walk up and down behind it for exactly half an hour. She can come out to me there."
Sol had pointed as he spoke to a knot of young trees that hooded a knoll a little way off. "I'll go and tell her," said Pickety.
"I suppose they will be off somewhere, and she is busy getting ready?"
"Oh, no, they are not going to travel till next year. Ethelberta does not want to go anywhere, and Lord Mountclair cannot endure this changeable weather in any place but his own house."
"Poor fellow!"
"Then you will wait for her by the firs. I'll tell her at Chapter 46 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 46. Ankworth, continued. The Anglebury Highway. He had not paced behind the firs more than 10 minutes when Ethelberta appeared from the opposite side. A great inconvenience to herself, she had complied with his request. Ethelberta was trembling. She took her brother's hand and said, "Is father then gone?"
"Yes," said Sol. "I should have been gone likewise, but I thought you wanted to see me."
"Of course I did, and him too. Why did you come so mysteriously, and I must say unbecomingly? I'm afraid I did wrong in not informing you of my intention."
"To yourself you may have. Father would have liked a word with you before you did it."
"You both looked so forbidding that I did not like to stop the carriage when we passed you. I want to see you on an important matter, his leaving Mrs. Doncastle's service at once. I'm going to write and beg her to dispense with the notice, which I have no doubt she will do."
"He's very much upset about you."
"My secrecy was perhaps an error of judgment," she said sadly. "But I had reasons. Why did you and my father come here at all if you did not want to see me?"
"We did want to see you up to a certain time."
"You did not come to prevent my marriage?"
"We wished to see you before the marriage. I can't say more."
"I thought you might not approve of what I had done," said Ethelberta mournfully. "But a time may come when you will approve."
"Never."
"Don't be so harsh, Sol. A coronet covers a multitude of sins."
"A coronet! Good Lord, and you my sister! Look at my hand."
Sol extended his hand.
"Look how my thumb stands out at the root, as if it were out of joint, and that hard place inside there. Did you ever see anything so ugly as that hand, a misshaped monster, didn't he? That comes from the jack-plane, and my pushing against it day after day and year after year. If I were found drowned or buried, dressed or undressed, in fustian or in broadcloth, folk would look at my hand and say, 'That man's a carpenter.' Well, now, how can a man branded with work as I be brother to a viscountess without something be wrong? Of course there's something wrong in it, or he wouldn't have married you. Something which won't be righted without terrible suffering."
"No, no," said she, "you are mistaken. There is no such wonderful quality in a title in these days. What I really am is second wife to a quiet old country nobleman who has given up society. What more commonplace? My life will be as simple, even more simple than it was before."
"Berta, you work to false lines. Are creeping up among the useless lumber of our nation that'll be the first to burn if there comes a flare. I never seen such a deserter of your own lot as you be. But you were always like it, Berta, and I'm ashamed of ye. More than that, a good woman never marries twice."
"You are too hard, Sol," said the poor Viscountess, almost crying. "I've done it all for you. Even if I have made a mistake and given my ambition an ignoble turn, don't tell me so now, or you may do more harm in a minute than you will cure in a lifetime. It is absurd to let republican passions so blind you to fact. A family which can be honourably traced through history for 500 years does affect the heart of a person not entirely hardened against romance. Whether you like the peerage or no, they appeal to our historical sense and love of old associations."
"I don't care for history. Prophecy is the only thing can do poor men any good. When you were a girl you wouldn't drop a curtsy to 'em, historical or otherwise, and there you were right. But instead of sticking to such principles you must needs push up, so as to get girls such as you where wants to curtsy to you, not even thinking marriage with a bad man too great a price to pay for it."
"A bad man? What do you mean by that? Lord Mountclair is rather old, but he's worthy. What did you mean, Zohol?"
"Nothing, a mere summat to say."
At that moment Pickety emerged from behind a tree and told her sister that Lord Mountclair was looking for her. "Well, Sol, I cannot explain all to you now," she said. "I will send for you in London." She wished him good-bye, and they separated, Pickety accompanying Sol a little on his way. Ethelberta was greatly perturbed by this meeting. After retracing her steps a short distance, she still felt so distressed and unpresentable that she resolved not to allow Lord Mountclair to see her till the clouds had somewhat passed off. It was but a bare act of justice to him to hide from his sight such a bridal mood as this. It was better to keep him waiting than to make him positively unhappy. She turned aside and went up the valley, where the park merged in miles of wood and copse. She opened an iron gate and found the wood casually interested in the vast variety of colours that the half-fallen leaves of the season wore. Much more occupied with personal thought. The path she pursued became gradually involved in bushes as well as trees, giving to the spot the character rather of a coppice than a wood. Perceiving that she had gone far enough, Ethelberta turned back by a path which at this point intersected that by which she had approached, and promised a more direct return towards the court. She had not gone many steps among the hazels, which here formed a perfect thicket, when she observed a belt of holly bushes in their midst. Towards the outskirts of these an opening on her left hand directly led, thence winding round into a clear space of greensward, which they completely enclosed. On this isolated and mewed-up bit of lawn stood a timber-built cottage, having ornamental barge-boards, balconets, and porch. It was an erection interesting enough as an experiment,
and grand as a toy, but as a building contemptible. A blue gauze of smoke floated over the chimney, as if somebody was living there. Round towards the side some empty hen-coops were piled away, while under the hollies were divers frameworks of wire netting and sticks, showing that birds were kept here at some seasons of the year. Being lady of all she surveyed, Ethelberta crossed the leafy sward and knocked at the door. She was interested in knowing the purpose of the peculiar little edifice. The door was opened by a woman wearing a clean apron upon a not very clean gown. Ethelberta asked who lived in so pretty a place.
"Miss Cruchette,"
the servant replied.
"but she's not here now."
"Does she live here alone?"
"Yes, excepting myself and a fellow servant."
"Oh.
She lives here to attend to the pheasants and poultry, because she's so clever in managing them. They are brought here from the keepers over the hill. Her father was a fancier."
"Miss Cruchette attends to the birds, and 2 servants attend to Miss Cruchette?"
"Well, to tell the truth, the servants do almost all of it. Still, that's what Miss Cruchette is here for. Would you like to see the house? It is pretty."
The woman spoke with hesitation, as if in doubt between the desire of earning a shilling and the fear that Ethelberta was not a stranger. That Ethelberta was Lady Mountclair she plainly did not dream. "I fear I can scarcely stay long enough, yet I will just look in," said Ethelberta, and as soon as they had crossed the threshold she was glad of having done so. The cottage internally may be described as a sort of boudoir extracted from the bulk of a mansion and deposited in a wood. The front room was filled with knick-knacks, curious work-tables, filigree baskets, twisted brackets supporting statuettes in which the grotesque in every case ruled the design, love-birds in gilt cages, French bronzes, wonderful boxes, needlework of strange patterns, and other attractive objects. The apartment was one of those which seemed to laugh in a visitor's face, and on closer examination expressed frivolity more distinctly than by words. "Miss Cruchette is here to keep the fowls?" said Ethelberta in a puzzled tone, after a survey.
"Yes, but they don't keep her."
Ethelberta did not attempt to understand, and ceased to occupy her mind with the matter. They came from the cottage to the door, where she gave the woman a trifling sum and turned to leave. But footsteps were at that moment to be heard beating among the leaves on the other side of the hollies, and Ethelberta waited till the walkers should have passed. The voices of 2 men reached herself and the woman as they stood. They were close to the house, yet screened from it by the holly bushes, when one could be heard to say distinctly, as if with his face turned to the cottage, "Lady Mountclair gone for good?"
"I suppose so." "Ha, ha! So come, so go."
The speakers passed on, their backs becoming visible through the opening. They appeared to be woodmen. "What Lady Mountclair do they mean?" said Ethelberta. The woman blushed.
"They meant Miss Cruchette."
"Oh, a nickname?"
"Yes."
"Why?" The woman whispered why in a story of about 2 minutes' length. Ethelberta turned pale. "Is she going to return?" she inquired, in a thin, hard voice.
"Yes, next work. You know her, Mum."
"No, I am a stranger."
"So much the better. I may tell you, then, that an old tale is flying about the neighbourhood that Lord Mountclair was privately married to another woman at Knowlsea this morning early. Can it be true?"
"I believe it to be true."
"And that she is of no family?"
"Of no family."
"Indeed, then the Lord only knows what will become of the poor thing. There will be murder between 'em."
"Between whom?"
"Her and the lady who lives here. She won't budge an inch, not she."
Ethelberta moved aside. A shade seemed to overspread the world, the sky, the trees, and the objects in the foreground. She kept her face away from the woman, and, whispering a reply to her good morning, passed through the hollies into the leaf-strewn path. As soon as she came to a large trunk, she placed her hands against it,
and rested her face upon them. She drew herself lower down, lower, lower, till she crouched upon the leaves. "Ay, 'tis what father and Sol meant. Oh, heaven!" she whispered. She soon arose and went on her way to the house. Her fair features were firmly set, and she scarcely heeded the path in the concentration which had followed her paroxysm. When she reached the park proper, she became aware of an excitement that was in progress there. Ethelberta's absence had become unaccountable to Lord Mountclare, who could hardly permit her retirement from his sight for a minute. But at first he had made due allowance for her eccentricity as a woman of genius, and would not take notice of the half-hour's desertion, unpardonable as it might have been in other classes of wives. Then he had inquired, searched, been alarmed. He had finally sent men-servants in all directions about the park to look for her. He feared she had fallen out of a window, down a well, or into the lake. The next stage of search was to have been drags and grapnels. But Ethelberta entered the house. Lord Mountclare rushed forward to meet her, and such was her contrivance that he noticed no change. The searchers were called in, Ethelberta explaining that she had merely obeyed the wish of her brother in going out to meet him. Pickety, who had returned from her walk with Sol, was upstairs in one of the rooms which had been allotted to her. Ethelberta managed to run in there on her way upstairs to her own chamber. "Pickety, put your things on again," she said. "You are the only friend I have in this house, and I want one badly. Go to Sol and deliver this message to him, that I want to see him at once. You must overtake him if you walk all the way to Anglebury. But the train does not leave till 4, so that there is plenty of time." "What is the matter?" said Pickety. "I cannot walk all the way." "I don't think you will have to do that. I hope not." "He's going to stop at Corvesgate to have a bite of lunch. I might overtake him there if I must." "Yes, and tell him to come to the east passage door. It is that door next to the entrance to the stable-yard. There is a little yew tree outside it. On second thoughts, you, dear, must not come back. Wait at Corvesgate in the little inn parlour till Sol comes to you again. You will probably then have to go home to London alone, but do not mind it. The worst part for you will be in going from the station to the Crescent, but nobody will molest you in a 4-wheel cab. You've done it before. However, he will tell you if this is necessary when he gets back. I can best fight my battles alone. You shall have a letter from me the day after tomorrow, stating where I am. I shall not be here." "But what is so dreadful?" "Nothing to frighten you." But she spoke with a breathlessness that completely nullified the assurance. "It is merely that I find I must come to an explanation with Lord Mountclare before I can live here permanently, and I cannot stipulate with him while I am here in his power. Till I write, good-bye. Your things are not unpacked, so let them remain here for the present. They can be sent for." Poor Pickety, more agitated than her sister, but never questioning her orders, went downstairs and out of the house. She ran across the shrubberies into the park, and to the gate whereat Sol had emerged some half-hour earlier. She trotted along upon the turnpike road like a lost doe, crying as she went at the new trouble which had come upon Berta, whatever that trouble might be. Behind her she heard wheels and the stepping of a horse, but she was too concerned to turn her head. The pace of the vehicle slackened, however, when it was abreast of Pickety, and she looked up to see Christopher as the driver. "Miss Chickerell," he said with surprise. Pickety had quickly looked down again, and she murmured, "Yes." Christopher asked what he could not help asking in the circumstances. "Would you like to ride?" "I should be glad," said she, overcoming her flurry. "I am anxious to overtake my brother Sol." "I have arranged to pick him up at Corvesgate," said Christopher. He descended and assisted her to mount beside him, and drove on again almost in silence. He was inclined to believe that some supernatural legerdemain had to do with these periodic impacts of Pickety on his path. She sat mute and melancholy till they were within half a mile of Corvesgate. "Thank you," she said then, perceiving Sol upon the road. "There is my brother. I will get down now." "He was going to ride on to Anglebury with me," said Julian. Peggotty did not reply, and Sol turned round. Seeing her, he instantly exclaimed, "What's the matter, Peggotty?" She explained to him that he was to go back immediately and meet her sister at the door by the yew, as Ethelberta had charged her. Christopher, knowing them so well, was too much an interested member of the group to be left out of confidence, and she included him in her audience. "And what are you to do?" said Sol to her. "I am to wait at Corvsgate till you come to me." "I can't understand it," Sol muttered with a gloomy face. "There's something wrong, and it was only to be expected. That's what I say, Mr. Julian." "If necessary, I can take care of Miss Chickerell till you come," said Christopher. "Thank you," said Sol. "Then I'll return to you as soon as I can at the Castle Inn just ahead. 'Tis very awkward for you to be so burdened by us, Mr. Julian, but we are in a trouble that I don't yet see the bottom of." "I know," said Christopher kindly. "We will wait for you." He then drove on with Peggotty to the inn, which was not far off, and Sol returned again to Ankworth. Feeling somewhat like a thief in the night, he zigzagged through the park, behind belts and knots of trees, until he saw the yew, dark and clear, as if drawn in ink upon the fair face of the mansion. The way up to it was in a little cutting between shrubs, the door being a private entrance sunk below the surface of the lawn, and invisible from other parts of the same front. As soon as he reached it, Ethelberta opened it at once, as if she had listened for his footsteps. She took him along a passage in the basement, up a flight of steps, and into a huge, solitary, chill apartment. It was the ballroom. Spacious mirrors in gilt frames formed panels on the lower parts of the walls, the remainder being toned in sage green. In a recess between each mirror was a statue. The ceiling rose in a segmental curve, and bore, sprawling upon its face, gilt figures of wanton goddesses, cupids, satyrs with tambourines, drums, and trumpets, the whole ceiling seeming alive with them. But the room was very gloomy now, there being little light admitted from without, and the reflections from the mirrors gave a depressing coldness to the scene. It was a place intended to look joyous by night, and whatever it chose to look by day. "We are safe here," said she, "but we must listen for footsteps. I have only 5 minutes. Lord Mountclair is waiting for me. I mean to leave this place, come what may." "Why?" said Sol in astonishment. "I cannot tell you. Something has occurred. God has got me in his power at last, and is going to scourge me for my bad doings. That's what it seems like. Sol, listen to me, and do exactly what I say. Go to Anglebury, hire a broom, bring it on as far as Little Ankworth. You will have to meet me with it at one of the park gates later in the evening, probably the west, at 7:30. Leave it at the village with the man, come on here on foot, and stay under the trees till just before 6. It will then be quite dark, and you must stand until the projecting balustrade a little further on than the door you came in by. I will just step upon the balcony over it, and will tell you more exactly than I can now, the precise time that I shall be able to slip out, and where the carriage is to be waiting, but it may not be safe to speak on account of his closeness to me. I will hand down a note. I find it impossible to leave the house by daylight. I am certain to be pursued. He already suspects something. Now I must be going, or he will be here, for he watches my movements because of some accidental words that escaped me." "Berta, I shan't have anything to do with this," said Sol. "It's not right." "I'm only going to Rouen, to Aunt Charlotte," she implored. "I want to get to Southampton to be in time for the midnight steamer. When I am at Rouen I can negotiate with Lord Mountclair the terms on which I will return to him. It is the only chance I have of rooting out a scandal and a disgrace which threatens the beginning of my life here. My letters to him and his to me can be forwarded through you or through father, and he will not know where I am. Any woman is justified in adopting such a course to bring her husband to a sense of her dignity. If I don't go away now, it will end in a permanent separation. If I leave at once and stipulate that he gets rid of her, we may be reconciled." "I can't help you. You must stick to your husband. I don't like them or any of their sort, barring about 3 or 4, for the reason that they despise me and all my sort. But, Ethelberta, for all that, I'll play fair with them.
No half-and-half trimming business. You've joined 'em, and arrayed yourself against us, and there you better bide. You've married your man, and your duty is towards him. I know what he is, and so does father. But if I were to help you to run away now, I should scorn myself more than I scorn him."
"I don't care for that, for any such politics. The Mountclair line is noble, and how was I to know that this member was not noble too? As the representative of an illustrious family, I was taken with him, but as a man, I must shun him."
"How can you shun him? You've married him."
"Nevertheless, I won't stay. Neither law nor gospel demands it from me after what I have learnt. And if law and gospel did demand it, I would not stay. And if you will not help me to escape, I go alone."
"You better not try any such wild thing."
The creaking of a door was heard. "Oh, Sol," she said appealingly, "don't go into the question whether I am right or wrong. Only remember that I am very unhappy. Do help me. I have no other person in the world to ask. Be under the balcony at 6 o'clock. Say you will. I must go. Say you will."
"I'll think," said Sol, very much disturbed. "There, don't cry. I'll try to be under the balcony at any rate. I cannot promise more, but I'll try to be there."
She opened in the panelling one of the old-fashioned concealed modes of exit known as jib doors, which it was once the custom to construct with architraves in the walls of large apartments, so as not to interfere with the general design of the room. Sol found himself in a narrow passage running down the whole length of the ballroom, and at the same time he heard Lord Mountclair's voice within, talking to Ethelberta. Sol's escape had been marvellous. As it was, the Viscount might have seen her tears. He passed down some steps, along an area from which he could see into a row of servants' offices, among them a kitchen with a fireplace flaming like an altar of sacrifice. Nobody seemed to be concerned about him. There were workmen upon the premises, and he nearly matched them. At last he got again into the shrubberies, and to the side of the park by which he had entered. On reaching Corvsgate, he found Pickety in the parlour of the little inn, as he had directed. Mr. Julian, she said, had walked up to the ruins, and would be back again in a few minutes. Sol ordered the horse to be put in, and by the time it was ready Christopher came down from the hill. Room was made for Sol by opening the flap of the dog-cart, and Christopher drove on. He was anxious to know the trouble, and Sol was not reluctant to share the burden of it with one whom he believed to be a friend. He told, scrap by scrap, the strange request of Ethelberta. Christopher, though ignorant of Ethelberta's experience that morning, instantly assumed that the discovery of some concealed spectre had led to this precipitancy. "When does she wish you to meet her with a carriage?"
"Probably at 7:30 at the West Lodge, but that is to be finally fixed by a note she will hand down to me from the balcony."
"Which balcony?"
"The nearest to the yew tree."
"At what time will she hand the note?"
"As the court clock strikes 6, she says, and if I am not there to take her instructions, of course she will give up the idea, which is just what I wanted to do."
Christopher begged Sol to go. Whether Ethelberta was right or wrong, he did not stop to inquire. She was in trouble. She was too clear-headed to be in trouble without good reason, and she wanted assistance out of it. But such was Sol's nature that the more he reflected, the more determined was he in not giving way to her entreaty. By the time that they reached Anglebury, he repented having given way so far as to withhold a direct refusal.
"It can do no good," he said mournfully. "It is better to nip our notion in its beginning. She says she wants to fly to Rouen, and from there arrange terms with him. But it can't be done. She should have thought of terms before."
Christopher made no further reply. Leaving word at the Red Lion that a man was to be sent to take the horse of him, he drove directly onwards to the station. "Then you don't mean to help her?" said Julian, when Sol took the tickets, one for himself and one for Pickety.
"I serve her best by leaving her alone," said Sol.
"I don't think so."
"She has married him."
"She's in distress."
"She's married him."
Sol and Pickety took their seats, Pickety upbraiding her brother. "I can go by myself," she said in tears. "Do go back for Berta, Sol. She said I was to go home alone, and I can do it."
"You must not. It is not right for you to be hiring cabs and driving across London at midnight. Berta should have known better than propose it."
She was flurried. "Go, Sol." But her entreaty was fruitless.
"Have you got your ticket, Mr. Julian?" said Sol. "I suppose we shall go together till we get near Melchester."
"I have not got my ticket yet. I'll be back in 2 minutes." The minutes went by, and Christopher did not reappear. The train moved off. Christopher was seen running up the platform, as if in a vain hope to catch it.
"He's missed the train,"
said Sol. Pickety looked disappointed, and said nothing. They were soon out of sight.
"God forgive me for such a hollow pretence,"
said Christopher to himself. "But he would have been uneasy had he known I wished to stay behind. I cannot leave her in trouble like this." He went back to the Red Lion with the manner and movement of a man who, after a lifetime of desultoriness, has at last found something to do. It was now getting late in the afternoon. Christopher ordered a one-horse brougham at the inn, and entering it was driven out of the town towards Enkworth as the evening shades were beginning to fall. They passed into the hamlet of Little Enkworth at 5:30, and drew up at a beer-house at the end. Jumping out here, Julian told the man to wait till he should return. Thus far he had exactly obeyed her orders to Sol. He had hoped to be able to obey them throughout, and supply her with the aid her brother refused. He also hoped that the change in the personality of her confederate would make no difference to her intention. That he was putting himself in a wrong position he allowed, but time and attention were requisite for such analysis. Meanwhile, Ethelberta was in trouble. On the one hand, she was waiting hopefully for Sol. On the other was Sol many miles on his way to town. Between them was himself. He ran with all his might towards Enkworth Park, mounted the lofty stone steps by the lodge, saw the dark bronze figures on the piers through the twilight, and then proceeded to thread the trees. Among these he struck a light for a moment. It was 10 minutes to 6. In another 5 minutes he was panting beneath the walls of her house. Enkworth Court was not unknown to Christopher, for he had frequently explored that spot in his Sandbourne days. He perceived now why she had selected that particular balcony for handing down directions. It was the only one round the house that was low enough to be reached from the outside, the basement here being a little way sunk in the ground. He went close under, turned his face outwards, and waited. About a foot over his head was the stone floor of the balcony, forming a ceiling to his position. At his back, 2 or 3 feet behind, was a blank wall, the wall of the house. In front of him was the misty park, crowned by a sky sparkling with winter stars. This was abruptly cut off upward by the dark edge of the balcony which overhung him. It was as if some person within the room above had been awaiting his approach. He had scarcely found time to observe his situation when a human hand and portion of a bare arm were thrust between the balusters, descended a little way from the edge of the balcony, and remained hanging across the starlit sky. Something was between the fingers. Christopher lifted his hand, took the scrap, which was paper, and the arm was withdrawn. As it withdrew, a jewel on one of the fingers sparkled in the rays of a large planet that rode in the opposite sky. Light steps retreated from the balcony, and a window closed. Christopher had almost held his breath, lest Ethelberta should discover him at the critical moment to be other than Sol, and mar her deliverance by her alarm. The still silence was anything but silence to him. He felt as if he were listening to the clanging chorus of an oratorio. And then he could fancy he heard words between Ethelberta and the Viscount within the room. They were evidently at very close quarters, and dexterity must have been required of her. He went on tiptoe across the gravel to the grass, and once on that he strode in the direction whence he had come. By the thick trunk of one of a group of aged trees he stopped to get a light, just as the court clock struck 6 in loud, long tones. The transaction had been carried out, through her impatience possibly, 4 or 5 minutes before the time appointed. The note contained, in a shaken hand, in which, however, the well-known characters were distinguishable, these words in pencil: "At 7:30 o'clock, just outside the North Lodge. Don't fail." This was the time she had suggested to Sol as that which would probably best suit her escape, if she could escape at all. She had changed the place from the West to the North Lodge, nothing else. The latter was certainly more secluded, though a trifle more remote from the course of the proposed journey. There was just enough time, and none to spare, for fetching the broom from Little Enkworth to the lodge, the village being 2 miles off. The few minutes gained by her readiness at the balcony were useful now. He started at once for the village, diverging somewhat to observe the spot appointed for the meeting. It was excellently chosen. The gate appeared to be little used, the lane outside it was covered with trees, and all around was silent as the grave. After this hasty survey by the wan starlight, he hastened on to Little Enkworth. An hour and a quarter later, a little brougham without lamps was creeping along by the park wall towards this spot. The leaves were so thick upon the unfrequented road that the wheels could not be heard, and the horse's pacing made scarcely more noise than a rabbit would have done in limping along. The vehicle progressed slowly, for they were in good time. About 10 yards from the park entrance it stopped, and Christopher stepped out. "We may have to wait here 10 minutes," he said to the driver, "and then we shall be able to reach Anglebury in time for the up mail train to Southampton." 7:30, 8:30, 9:30, 2 hours. Oh, yes, sir, easily. A young lady in the case, perhaps, sir? Yes. Well, I hope she'll be done honestly by, even if she is of humble station. 'Tis best and cheapest, too, in the long run. The coachman was apparently imagining that the dove about to flit away to be one of the pretty maidservants that abounded in Enkworth Court. Such escapades as these were not unfrequent among them, her fair face having been deemed a sufficient recommendation to service in that house, without too close an inquiry into character, since the death of the first Viscountess. Now then, silence, and listen for a footstep at the gate. Such calmness as there was in the musician's voice had been produced by considerable effort, for his heart had begun to beat fast and loud as he strained his attentive ear to catch the footfall of a woman who could only be his illegally. The obscurity was as great as a starry sky would permit it to be. Beneath the trees where the carriage stood, Chapter 47 of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 47. Enkworth and its Precincts, Melchester. To be wise after the event is often to act foolishly with regard to it, and to preserve the illusion which has led to the event would frequently be a course that omniscience itself could not find fault with. Reaction with Ethelberta was complete, and the more violent in that it had threatened to be useless. Sol's bitter chiding had been the first thing to discompose her fortitude. It reduced her to a consciousness that she had allowed herself to be coerced in her instincts, and yet had not triumphed in her duty. She might have pleased her family better by pleasing her tastes, and have entirely avoided the grim irony of the situation disclosed later in the day. After the second interview with Sol, which she was to some extent composed in mind by being able to nurse a definite intention. As momentum causes the narrowest wheel to stand upright, a scheme, fairly imbibed, will give the weakest some power to maintain a position stoically. In the temporary absence of Lord Mountclere, about 6 o'clock, she slipped out upon the balcony and handed down a note. To her relief, her hand received it instantly. The hour and a half wanting to 7:30 she passed with great effort. The main part of the time was occupied by dinner, during which she attempted to devise some scheme for leaving him without suspicion just before the appointed moment. Happily, and as if by a providence, there was no necessity for any such thing. A little while before the half-hour, when she moved to rise from dinner, he also arose, tenderly begging her to excuse him for a few minutes, that he might go and write an important note to his lawyer, until that moment forgotten, though the postman was nearly due. She heard him retire along the corridor and shut himself into his study, his promised time of return being a quarter of an hour thence. 5 minutes after that memorable parting, Ethelberta came from the little door by the bush of yew, well and thickly wrapped up from head to heels. She skimmed across the park and under the boughs like a shade, mounting then the stone steps for pedestrians which were fixed beside the park gates here, as at all the lodges. Outside, and below her, she saw an oblong shape. It was a broom, and it had been drawn forward close to the bottom of the steps, that she might not have an inch further to go on foot than to this barrier. The whole precinct was thronged with trees, half their foliage being overhead, the other half underfoot, for the gardeners had not yet begun to rake and collect the leaves. Thus it was that her dress rustled as she descended the steps. The carriage door was held open by the driver, and she entered instantly. He shut her in and mounted to his seat. As they drove away, she became conscious of another person inside. "Oh, Sol, it is done," she whispered, believing the man to be her brother. Her companion made no reply. Ethelberta, familiar with Sol's moods of troubled silence, did not press for an answer. It was indeed certain that Sol's assistance would have been given under a sullen protest. Even if unwilling to disappoint her, he might well have been taciturn and angry at her course. They sat in silence, and in total darkness. The road ascended an incline, the horse's tramp being still deadened by the carpet of leaves. Then the large trees on either hand became interspersed by a low brushwood of varying sorts, from which a large bird occasionally flew, in its fright at their presence beating its wings recklessly against the hard stems with force enough to cripple the delicate quills. It showed how deserted was the spot after nightfall. "Sol," said Ethelberta again, "why not talk to me?" She now noticed that her fellow-traveller kept his head and his whole person as snugly back in the corner out of her way as it was possible to do. She was not exactly frightened, but she could not understand the reason. The carriage gave a quick turn and stopped. "Where are we now?" she said. "Shall we get to Angleby by 9? What's the time, Sol?" "I will see," replied her companion. They were the first words he had uttered. The voice was so different from her brother's that she was terrified. Her limbs quivered. In another instant the speaker had struck a wax vesta, and holding it erect in his fingers, he looked her in her face. "He, he, he, he!" The laughter was her husband, the Viscount. He laughed again, and his eyes gleamed like a couple of tarnished brass buttons in the light of the wax match. Ethelberta might have fallen dead with the shock, so terrible and hideous was it. Yet she did not. She neither shrieked nor fainted. But no poor January field-fare was ever colder, no ice-house more dank with perspiration, than she was then. "A very pleasant joke, my dear, he, he, and no more than was to be expected on this merry, happy day of our lives. Nobody enjoys a good jest more than I do. I always enjoy a jest. He, 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 he. Now we are in the dark again, and we will alight and walk. The path is too narrow for the carriage, but it will not be far for you. Take your husband's arm." While he had been speaking, a defiant pride had sprung up in her, instigating her to conceal every weakness. He had opened the carriage door and stepped out. She followed, taking the offered arm. "Take the horse and carriage to the stables," said the Viscount to the coachman, who was his own servant, the vehicle and horse being also his. The coachman turned the horse's head and vanished down the woodland track by which they had descended. The Viscount moved on, uttering private chuckles as numerous as a woodpecker's taps, and Ethelberta with him. She walked as by a miracle, but she would walk. She would have died rather than not have walked then.
She perceived now that they were somewhere in Ankworth Wood. As they went, she noticed a faint shine upon the ground on the other side of the Viscount, which showed her that they were walking beside a wet ditch. She remembered having seen it in the morning. It was a shallow ditch of mud. She might push him in and run, and so escape before he could extricate himself. It would not hurt him. It was her last chance. She waited a moment for the opportunity. "We are 1-to-1, and I am the stronger," she at last exclaimed triumphantly, and lifted her hand for a thrust. "On the contrary, darling, we are 1-to-half-a-dozen, and you considered me the weaker," he tenderly replied, stepping back adroitly and blowing a whistle. At once the bushes seemed to be animated in 4 or 5 places. "John," he said in the direction of one of them. "Yes, my lord," replied a voice from the bush, and a keeper came forward. "William?" Another man advanced from another bush. "Quite right. Remain where you are for the present. Is Tompkins there?" "Yes, my lord," said a man from another part of the thicket. "You go and keep watch by the further lodge, for there are poachers about. Where is Strongway?" "Just below, my lord." "Tell him and his brother to go to the west gate and walk up and down. Let them search round it among the trees inside. Anybody there who cannot give a good account of himself to be brought before me tomorrow morning. I am living at the cottage at present. That's all I have to say to you." And turning round to Ethelberta, "Now, dearest, we will walk a little further, if you are able. I have provided that your friends shall be taken care of." He tried to pull her hand towards him, gently, like a cat opening a door. They walked a little onward, and Lord Mountclair spoke again with imperturbable good humour. "I will tell you a story to pass the time away. I have learnt the art from you. Your mantle has fallen upon me, and all your inspiration with it. Listen, dearest. I saw a young man come to the house to-day. Afterwards I saw him cross a passage in your company. You entered the ballroom with him. That room is a treacherous place. It is panelled with wood, and between the panels on the walls are passages for the servants, opening from the room by doors hidden in the woodwork. Lady Mountclair knew of one of these, and made use of it to let out her conspirator. Lord Mountclair knew of another, and made use of it to let in himself. His sight is not good, but his ears are unimpaired. A meeting was arranged to take place at the west gate at 7:30, unless a note handed from the balcony mentioned another time and place. He heard it all, he. When Lady Mountclair's confederate came for the note, I was in waiting above, and handed one down a few minutes before the hour struck, confirming the time, but changing the place. When Lady Mountclair handed down her note just as the clock was striking, her confederate had gone, and I was standing beneath the balcony to receive it. She dropped it into her husband's hands. Lord Mountclair ordered a brougham to be at the West Lodge, as fixed by Lady Mountclair's note. Probably Lady Mountclair's friend ordered a brougham to be at the North Gate, as fixed by my note, written imitation of Lady Mountclair's hand. Lady Mountclair came to the spot she had mentioned, and like a good wife rushed into the arms of her husband. As if by an ungovernable impulse, Ethelberta broke into laughter also, laughter which had a wild, unnatural sound. It was hysterical. She sank down upon the leaves, and there continued the fearful laugh just as before. Lord Mountclair became greatly frightened. The spot they had reached was a green space within a girdle of hollies, and in front of them rose an ornamental cottage. This was the building which Ethelberta had visited earlier in the day. It was the Petit Trianon of Ankworth Court. The Viscount left her side and hurried forward. The door of the building was opened by a woman. "Have you prepared for us, as I directed?" "Yes, my lord. Tea and coffee are both ready." "Never mind that now. Lady Mountclair is ill. Come and assist her indoors. Tell the other woman to bring wine and water at once." He returned to Ethelberta. She was better, and was sitting calmly on the bank. She rose without assistance. "You may retire," he said to the woman who had followed him, and she turned round. When Ethelberta saw the building, she drew back quickly. "Where is the other Lady Mountclair?" she inquired. "Gone." "She shall never return? Never?" "Never. It was not intended that she should." That sounds well. Lord Mountclair, we may as well compromise matters.
I think so too. It becomes a lady to make a virtue of a necessity.
It was stratagem against stratagem. Mine was ingenious, yours was masterly. Accept my acknowledgment. We will enter upon an armed neutrality.
No, let me be your adorer and slave again, as ever. Your beauty, dearest, covers everything. You are my mistress and queen. But here we are at the door. Tea is prepared for us here. I have a liking for life in this cottage mode, and live here on occasion. Women attend, Lady Mountclair.
The woman who had seen Ethelberta in the morning was alarmed at recognizing her, having since been informed officially of the marriage. She murmured entreaties for pardon. They assisted the Viscountess to a chair. The door was closed, and the wind blew past as if nobody had ever stood there to interrupt its flight. Full of misgivings, Christopher continued to wait at the north gate. 7:30 had long since been past, and no Ethelberta had appeared. He did not for the moment suppose the delay to be hers, and this gave him patience. Having taken up the position, he was induced by fidelity to abide by the consequences. It would only be a journey of 2 hours to reach Anglebury station. He would ride outside with the driver, put her into the train, and bid her adieu for ever. She had cried for help, and he had heard her cry. At last, through the trees came the sound of the court clock striking 8, and then, for the first time, a doubt arose in his mind whether she could have mistaken the gate. She had distinctly told Sol the West Lodge. Her note had expressed the North Lodge. Could she by any accident have written one thing while meaning another? He entered the carriage and drove round to the West Gate. All was as silent there as at the other, the meeting between Ethelberta and Lord Mountclair being then long past, and he drove back again. He left the carriage and entered the park on foot, approaching the house slowly. All was silent. The windows were dark. Moping sounds came from the trees and sky, as from sorrow whispering to night. At this time he felt assured that the scheme had miscarried. While he stood there, a carriage without lights came up the drive. It turned in towards the stable yard without going to the door. The carriage had plainly been empty. Returning across the grass by the way he had come, he was startled by the voices of 2 men from the road hard by.
"Have ye seed anybody?"
"Not a soul."
"Shall we go across again?"
"Oh, what's the good? Let's home to supper."
"My lord must have heard somebody. He wouldn't have said it."
"Perhaps he's nervous now he's living in the cottage again.
I thought that fancy was over. Well, I'm glad 'tis a young wife he's brought us. She'll have her routs and her rackets as well as the high-born ones, you'll see, as soon as she gets used to the place. She must be a queer Christian to pick up with him. Well, if she's charity, 'tis enough for we poor men. Her faith and hope may be as please God. Now I be for on along homeward."
As soon as they had gone, Christopher moved from his hiding, and, avoiding the gravel walk, returned to his coachman, telling him to drive at once to Anglebury. Julian was so impatient of the futility of his adventure that he wished to annihilate its existence. On reaching Anglebury, he determined to get on at once to Melchester, that the event of the night might be summarily ended. To be still in the neighbourhood was to be still engaged in it. He reached home before midnight. Walking to their house in a quiet street, as dissatisfied with himself as a man well could be, who still retained health and an occupation, he found Faith sitting up as usual. His news was simple. The marriage had taken place before he could get there, and he had seen nothing of either ceremony or Viscountess. The remainder he reserved for a more convenient season. Edith looked anxiously at him as he ate supper, smiling now and then. "Well, I am tired of this life," said Christopher. "So am I," said Faith. "Ah, we were only rich."
"Ah, yes."
"Or if we were not rich," she said, turning her eyes to the fire, "if we were only slightly provided for, it would be better than nothing. How much would you be content with, Kit?"
As much as I could get.
Would you be content with 1,000 a year for both of us?
I dare say I should, he murmured, breaking his bread.
Or 500 a year for both?
Or 500.
Or even 300?
Bother 300 less than double the sum would not satisfy me. We may as well imagine much as little. Faith's countenance had fallen.
"Oh, Kit," she said, "you always disappoint me."
"I do. How do I disappoint you this time?"
"By not caring for 300 a year, 150 each, when that is all I have to offer you."
"Faith," said he, looking up for the first time,
"are of course Lucy's will. I had forgotten." "It is true, and I have prepared such a pleasant surprise for you, and now you don't care. Our cousin, Lucy, did leave us something after all. I don't understand the exact total sum, but it comes to 150 a year each, more than I expected, though not as much as you deserved. Here's the letter. I've been dwelling upon it all day, and thinking what a pleasure it would be, and it is not, after all."
"Good gracious, Faith, I was only supposing. The real thing is another matter altogether."
"Well, the idea of Lucy's will containing our names! I'm sure I would have gone to the funeral had I known." "I wish it were 1,000.
"Oh, no, it doesn't matter at all, but certainly 300 for two is a tantalizing sum. Not enough to enable us to change our condition, and enough to make us dissatisfied with going on as we are."
"We must forget we have it, and let it increase."
"It isn't enough to increase much. We may as well use it."
"But how? Take a bigger house? What's the use? Give up the organ?
Then I shall be rather worse off than I am at present. Positively, it is the most provoking amount anybody could have invented, had they tried ever so long. Poor Lucy to do that, and not even to come near us when father died." Sequel of The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Sequel: Anglebury, Ankworth, Sandbourne. 2 years and a half after the marriage of Ethelberta and the evening adventures which followed it, a man, young in years, though considerably older in mood and expression, walked up to the Red Lion Inn at Anglebury. The anachronism sat not unbecomingly upon him, and the voice was precisely that of the Christopher Julian of heretofore. His way of entering the inn and calling for a conveyance was more off-hand than formerly. He was much less afraid of the sound of his own voice now than when he had gone through the same performance on a certain chill evening the last time that he visited the spot. He wanted to be taken to Nulsea to meet the steamer there, and was not coming back by the same vehicle. It was a very different day from that of his previous journey along the same road, different in season, different in weather, and the humour of the observer differed yet more widely from its condition then than did the landscape from its former hues. In due time they reached a commanding situation upon the road, from which were visible knots and plantations of trees on the Ankworth manor. Christopher broke the silence. "Lord Mountclair is still alive and well, I'm told?" "Why, he'll live to be 100. Never such a change as has come over the man of late years."
"Indeed?" "Oh, 'tis my lady. She's a one to put up with. Still, 'tis said here and there that marrying her was the best day's work that he ever did in his life, although she's got to be my lord and my lady both."
"Is she happy with him?"
"She's very sharp with the poor man. But happy, I don't know. He was a good-natured old man for all his sins, and would sooner any day lay out money in new presents than pay it in old debts. But 'tis altered now. 'Tisn't the same place. In the old times I've seen the floor of the servants' hall over the vamp of your boot in solid beer that we had poured aside from the horns because we couldn't see straight enough to pour it in. See? Now we couldn't see a hole in a ladder. And now, even at Christmas or Whitsuntide, when a man, if ever he desires to be overcome with a drop, would naturally wish it to be, you can walk out of Ankworth as straight as you walked in. All her doings."
"Then she holds the reins?"
"She do." There was a little tussle at first, but how could an old man hold his own against such a spry young body as that? She threatened to run away from him, and kicked up Bob's a-dying, and I don't know what at all. And being the woman, of course she was sure to beat in the long run. Poor old nobleman, she marches him off to church every Sunday as regular as a clock, makes him read family prayers that haven't been read in Ankworth for the last 30 years to my certain knowledge, and keeps him down to 3 glasses of wine a day strict, so that you never see him any the more generous for liquor or a bit elevated at all, as he used to be. There, 'tis true it has done him good in one sense, for they say he'd have been dead in 5 years if he'd gone on as he was going. So that she's a good wife to him, after all? Well, if she'd been a little worse, 'twould have been a little better for him in one sense, for he would have had his own way more. But he was a curious feller at one time, as you all know, and I suppose 'tis as much as he could expect. But 'tis a strange reverse for him. It is said that when he's asked out to dine, or to anything in the way of a jaunt, his eyes fly across to her afore he answers, and if her eye says yes, he says yes, and if her eye says no, he says no. 'Tis a sad condition for one who ruled womankind as he, that a woman should lead him in a string whether he will or no. Sad indeed. She's steward and agent and everything. She's got a room called My Lady's Office, and great ledgers and cash books you never see the like. In old times there were bailiffs to look after the workfolk, foremen to look after the tradesmen, a building steward to look after the foreman, a land steward to look after the building steward, and a dashing grand agent to look after the land steward. Fine times they had then, I assure ye. My lady said they were eating out the property like a honeycomb, and then there was a terrible row. Half of 'em were sent flying, and now there's only the agent and the viscountess, and a sort of surveyor man, and of the 3 she does most work, so 'tis said. She marks the trees to be felled, settles what horses are to be sold and bought, and is out in all winds and weathers. There, if somebody hadn't looked into things, 'twould soon have been all up with his lordship. He was so very extravagant. In one sense 'twas lucky for him that she was born in humble life, because owing to it she knows the ins and outs of contriving, which he never did. Then a man on the verge of bankruptcy will do better to marry a poor and sensible wife than a rich and stupid one. Well, here we are at the 10th milestone. I will walk the remainder of the distance to Knowlesea, as there is ample time for meeting the last steamboat. When the man was gone, Christopher proceeded slowly on foot down the hill, and reached that part of the highway at which he had stopped in the cold November breeze, waiting for a woman who never came. He was older now, and he had ceased to wish that he had not been disappointed. There was the lodge, and around it were the trees, brilliant in the shining greens of June. Every twig sustained its bird, and every blossom its bee. The roadside was not muffled in a garment of dead leaves, as it had been then, and the lodge gate was not open, as it always used to be. He paused to look through the bars. The drive was well kept and gravelled, the grass edgings formerly marked by hoofs and ruts, and otherwise trodden away, were now green and luxuriant, bent sticks being placed at intervals as a protection. While he looked through the gate, a woman stepped from the lodge to open it. In her haste she nearly swung the gate into his face, and would have completely done so had he not jumped back. "I beg pardon, sir," she said on perceiving him. "I was going to open it for my lady, and I didn't see you." Christopher moved round the corner. The perpetual snubbing that he had received from Ethelberta ever since he had known her seemed about to be continued through the medium of her dependence. A trotting, accompanied by the sound of light wheels, had become perceptible, and then a vehicle came through the gate and turned up the road which he had come down. He saw the back of a basket carriage drawn by a pair of piebald ponies. A lad in livery sat behind with folded arms. The driver was a lady. He saw her bonnet, her shoulders, her hair, but no more. She lessened in his gaze, and was soon out of sight. He stood a long time thinking, but he did not wish her his. In this wholesome frame of mind he proceeded on his way, thankful that he had escaped meeting her, though so narrowly.
but perhaps at this remote season the embarrassment of a rencounter would not have been intense. At Nulsea he entered the steamer for Sandbourne. Mr. Chickerell and his family now lived at Firtop Villa, in that place, a house which, like many others, had been built since Julian's last visit to the town. He was directed to the outskirts, and into a fir plantation where drives and intersecting roads had been laid out, and where new villas had sprung up like mushrooms. He entered by a swing gate on which Firtop was painted, and a maid-servant showed him into a neatly furnished room, containing Mr. Chickerell, Mrs. Chickerell, and Pickety, the matron being reclined on a couch, which improved health had permitted her to substitute for a bed. He had been expected, and all were glad to see again the sojourner in foreign lands, even down to the ladylike Tabby, who was all purr and warmth towards him, except when she was all claws and nippers. But had the prime sentiment of the meeting shown itself, it would have been the unqualified surprise of Christopher at seeing how much Pickety's face had grown to resemble her sister's. It was less a resemblance in contours than in expression and tone. They had an early tea, and then Mr. Chickerell, sitting in a patriarchal chair, conversed pleasantly with his guest, being well acquainted with him through other members of the family. They talked of Julian's residence at different Italian towns with his sister, of Faith, who was at the present moment staying with some old friends in Melchester, and, as was inevitable, the discourse hovered over and settled upon Ethelberta, the prime ruler of the courses of them all, with little exception, through recent years. "It was a hard struggle for her," said Chickerell, looking reflectively out at the fir trees. "I never thought the girl would have got through it. When she first entered the house, everybody was against her. She had to fight a whole host of them single-handed. There was the Viscount's brother, other relations, lawyers, ladies, servants. Not one of them was her friend, and not one who wouldn't rather have seen her arrive there in evil relationship with him than as she did come. But she stood her ground. She was put upon her mettle, and one by one they got to feel there was somebody among them whose little finger, if they insulted her, was thicker than a Mountclair's loins. She must have had a will of iron. It was a situation that would have broken the hearts of a dozen ordinary women, for everybody soon knew that we were of no family, and that's what made it so hard for her. But there she is as mistress now, and everybody respecting her. I sometimes fancy she's occasionally too severe with the servants, and I know what service is. But she says it is necessary owing to her birth, and perhaps she is right." "I suppose she often comes to see you?" 4 or 5 times a year," said Pickety. "She cannot come quite so often as she would," said Mrs. Chickerell, "because of her lofty position, which has its duties. Well, as I always say, Berta doesn't take after me. I couldn't have married the man, even though he did bring a coronet with him." "I shouldn't have cared to let him ask ye," said Chickerell. "However, that's neither here nor there. All ended better than I expected. He's fond of her." "And it is wonderful what can be done with an old man when you are his darling," said Mrs. Chickerell. "If I were Berta, I should go to London oftener," said Pickety, to turn the conversation. "But she lives mostly in the library, and oh, what do you think? She's writing an epic poem, and employs Emmeline as her reader." "Dear me! And how are Sol and Dan? You mentioned them once in your letters," said Christopher. "Berta has set them up as builders in London." "She bought a business for them," said Chickerell. "But Sol wouldn't accept her help for a long time, and now he's only agreed to it on condition of paying her back the money with interest, which he's doing. They've just signed a contract to build a hospital for £20,000. Pickety broke in. "You knew that both Gwendolen and Cornelia married 2 years ago and went to Queensland? They married 2 brothers who were farmers, and left England the following week. Georgie and Myrtle are at school." "And Joey?" "We're thinking of making Joseph a parson," said Mrs. Chickerell. "Indeed, a parson?" "Yes, 'tis a genteel living for the boy, and he's talents that way. Since he's been under masters, he knows all the strange sounds the Romans and Greeks used to make by way of talking, and the love stories of the ancient women as if they were his own. I assure you, Mr. Julian, if you could hear how beautiful the boy tells about little Cupid with his bows and arrows, and the rows between that pagan apostle Jupiter and his wife because of another woman, and the handsome young gods who kissed Venus, you'd say he deserved to be made a bishop at once." The evening advanced, and they walked in the garden. Here, by some means, Peggotty and Christopher found themselves alone. "Your letters to my sister have been charming," said Christopher, "and so regular, too. It was as good as a birthday every time one arrived." Peggotty blushed and said nothing. Christopher had full assurance that her heart was where it always had been. A suspicion of the fact had been the reason of his visit here to-day. "Other letters were once written from England to Italy, and they acquired great celebrity. Do you know whose?" "Walpole's?" said Peggotty timidly. "Yes, but they never charmed me half as much as yours. You may rest assured that one person in the world thinks Walpole your second." "You should not have read them. They were not written to you. But I suppose you wish to hear of Ethelberta?" "At first I did," said Christopher, "but oddly enough I got more interested in the writer than in her news. I don't know if ever before there has been an instance of loving by means of letters. If not, it is because there has never been such sweet ones written. At last I looked for them more anxiously than Faith. You see, you knew me before." Peggotty would have withdrawn this remark if she could, fearing that it seemed like a suggestion of her love long ago. "Then on my return I thought I would just call and see you, and go away and think what would be best for me to do with a view to the future. But since I have been here, I felt that I could not go away to think without first asking you what you think on one point, whether you could ever marry me." "I thought you would ask that when I first saw you." "Did you? Why?" "You looked at me as if you would." "Well," continued Christopher, "the worst of it is that I am as poor as Job. Faith and I have 300 a year between us, but only half is mine. So that before I get your promise I must let your father know how poor I am. Besides what I mention, I have only my earnings by music. But I am to be installed as chief organist at Melchester soon, instead of deputy, as I used to be, which is something. I am to have £500 when I marry. That was Lord Mountclair's arrangement with Ethelberta. He is extremely anxious that I should marry well." "That's unfortunate. A marriage with me will hardly be considered well." "Oh, yes, it will," said Peggotty quickly, and then looked frightened. Christopher drew her towards him, and imprinted a kiss upon her cheek, at which Peggotty was not so wretched as she had been some years before, when he mistook her for another in that performance. "Berta will never let us come to want," she said with vivacity, when she had recovered. "She will always give me what is necessary." "We will endeavour not to trouble her," said Christopher, amused by Peggotty's utter dependence now, as ever, upon her sister, as upon an eternal providence. "However, it is well to be kin to a coach, though you never ride in it. Now, shall we go indoors to your father? You think he will not object?" "I think he will be very glad," replied Peggotty. "Berta will, I know." End